What's up, guys? Welcome to Harry Reality Bender. We've got something special today. What if Arcturus Black rescued Harry from the Dursleys and raised him to be the ruthless heir of House Black? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1, The Taking the Letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not by owl, Arcturus Black had long since warded his manor against unsolicited post, a precaution born from decades of navigating wizarding politics where information was currency and an intercepted letter could end a bloodline. No, this letter came the way all important things came to Arcturus Black, through channels he controlled, carried by a house elf who appeared at his elbow at precisely 7 in the morning while he was drinking his tea and reading the day's copy of the Daily Prophet. "Master Arcturus," said Creature, his voice a ruined rasp, eyes downcast in the way of old magic and older servitude. "A letter from Master Dumbledore's portrait at the ministry. The portrait says it is urgent." Arcturus set down his teacup without haste. He folded the prophet with the same deliberate precision he applied to everything, corners aligned, crease sharp, and held out one hand. Creature placed the envelope in his palm and vanished. The seal was purple wax, the Hogwarts crest pressed into it. Arcturus broke it with his thumb and read. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table beside his teacup, finished his tea, and sat for a long moment looking out the tall windows of Grimmauld Place's upper dining room at the grey London morning, the kind of sky that couldn't quite decide between cloud and fog and had settled for both. The letter was not from Dumbledore himself. It was a copy of a report. Someone in the Ministry's Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes had forwarded it through back channels to the portrait, which had forwarded it to Arcturus because the portrait, at least, still understood what obligations meant. The report documented a series of accidental magic incidents at a Muggle residence in Surrey. Number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging. The incidents had been logged and suppressed over a period of 4 years. 4 years. The same 4 years since his great-grandchild's child had been placed in that house. Arcturus stood up from the table. He did not rush. He went upstairs to his dressing room and put on his coat, charcoal wool, floor-length, cut in the style of 40 years ago because he had never found cause to update it, and he took his cane from the stand by the door. Not because he needed it to walk. He had not needed a walking aid since he was recovering from the curse Grindelwald's people had put on him in 1944. He took it because the cane housed a wand, and the wand housed 17 years of increasingly irritated magical intent, and Arcturus Black had a feeling, deep and cold in his chest, that he might need it before the morning was out. He went downstairs, past the portrait of his late wife Melania that watched him from the hallway with eyes that knew everything and said nothing, past the row of ancestral portraits that had governed the lives of this house for 300 years, and out the front door into the grey London morning. He apparat directly to Privet Drive. He had never been there before, but he was Arcturus Black, and he had memorized the address from the letter in the time it took to read it twice, and he did not make mistakes with apparition. He arrived on the pavement outside a row of identical houses that were so aggressively ordinary they bordered on hostile. Same brick. Same door. Same narrow strip of garden. The Muggle obsession with uniformity had always baffled him, as though sameness were a virtue rather than a failure of imagination. Number 4 was indistinguishable from its neighbors except for the large Muggle motorcar in the drive and the particular brand of smug prosperity that clung to the net curtains in every window. He walked up the front path and knocked. The woman who opened the door was tall, thin as a blade, with a long neck and the expression of someone who had spent considerable effort arranging their face into permanent disapproval. She looked at Arcturus, at his coat, his cane, his bearing, the quality of his absolute stillness, and her expression shifted through several emotions before settling on wariness. "Can I help you?" she said, in the tone of someone who hoped very much that she could not. "You are Petunia Dursley," Arcturus said. It was not a question. Previously Petunia Evans. "My name is Arcturus Black. I am the paternal great-grandfather of your late sister's son. I would like to come inside." Something moved behind the woman's eyes. Fear, he thought. Specific fear, not the generalized variety that Muggles sometimes developed around him when he used that tone. She knew what he was. She knew what he represented. She stepped back and let him in. The house was immaculate in a way that suggested performance, everything in its place with such precision that it felt like a stage set. Family photographs on the walls, all featuring a large blonde man and a large blonde boy at various stages of growth. A school uniform on a coat hook. Toys in a basket by the sitting room door. Arcturus noticed, in one smooth survey, that none of the photographs contained a dark-haired child. He stood in the hallway and looked at Petunia Dursley, who was wringing her hands with the studied casualness of someone trying to look like they weren't wringing their hands. "Where is the boy?" he said. He's upstairs. "He's perfectly fine, Mrs. Dursley," Arcturus said. "I have been in this house for 30 seconds and I am already aware that you are lying to me. I ask you to consider, carefully, whether you would like to continue doing so." She went the color of old plaster. "He's under the stairs," she said, very quietly. The silence that followed was not a comfortable one. Arcturus looked at the door beneath the staircase. A small door, cupboard-sized, barely, with a latch on the outside. He walked to it and lifted the latch and opened the door. The smell hit him first. Damp and old wool and the particular staleness of an enclosed space occupied by a living thing for too long. Then he crouched, an act of physical effort that he permitted himself no reaction to, and looked inside. The boy was in the back corner of the cupboard. He was small for 4 years old, wearing clothes that were 3 sizes too large and had clearly belonged to the heavier child whose photographs lined the hallway. He had black hair that went everywhere and enormous green eyes that caught the light from the hallway like a cat's. There was a bruise along his jaw that was 3 or 4 days old, faded yellow-green at the edges. He was looking at Arcturus with an expression that was not frightened. He had, it appeared, moved past frightened some time ago into something more pragmatic and more troubling. He was looking at Arcturus the way a creature looks at something unexpected, calculating, still, waiting to see what would happen next. Arcturus looked at the bolt on the outside of the cupboard door. Then he looked at the child. Then he looked at the bruise. "Come here," he said. The boy didn't move immediately. He held still for a long moment, assessing, and Arcturus thought with something that was not quite pain. The black line assessed everything, always, it was bred into them, before carefully, quietly, with the practiced movements of a child long accustomed to not making noise, he crawled forward and stopped at the edge of the cupboard door. Up close he was even smaller. Green eyes, his grandmother Doria's eyes, looked up at Arcturus with steady caution. "What's your name?" the boy asked. His voice was a small careful thing, like a candle in wind. "Arcturus Black," Arcturus said. "I am your great-grandmother Doria's father-in-law. We are family." The boy considered this for a moment with the gravity that 4-year-olds occasionally achieve when they are being completely serious. "Do you have a cupboard?" he asked. "I have 43 rooms," Arcturus said, "and none of them have bolts on the outside." The boy reached up and took his hand. Arcturus straightened, holding the child's hand in his, and turned back to Petunia Dursley, who had followed him and was now standing in the hallway with her arms crossed over her chest and the expression of a woman bracing for impact. "You will gather his things," Arcturus said. He doesn't have many things." The pause before that sentence told him what he needed to know. "Then there is nothing to gather," Arcturus said. "We will leave now. You will not contact me, the boy, or any member of my house. If you attempt to do so, I will ensure that your husband's business interests are reviewed by a set of financial investigators I have on retainer who are very good at their work and very thorough. Do you understand?" He watched her swallow. "What about, there are blood wards?" Dumbledore said, "I am aware of what Dumbledore said. I am also the head of an ancient and noble house, and my authority over the blood of my house supersedes any unilateral decision made by Albus Dumbledore, regardless of how many titles he collects." Arcturus looked at her steadily. "Dumbledore placed a child in your care. You put him in a cupboard. Do you genuinely believe you are in a position to argue blood ward protections with me?" She looked at the floor. "Mrs. Dursley," he said, and his voice was not unkind, merely absolute, "you have made a grave mistake with this child. I am choosing, at this moment, to make it your last one. Don't make me revise that decision." He walked out the front door with his great-great-grandchild's hand in his, into the grey Surrey morning, and he brought them both back to London before Petunia Dursley had closed her mouth. The boy was sick in a flower bed on the pavement outside Grimmauld Place immediately after they arrived, which was a common enough reaction to sidelong apparition for adults and a perfectly understandable one for a 4-year-old. Arcturus conjured a handkerchief, crouched again on the pavement outside his ancestral home, and wiped the child's mouth with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had raised children before and remembered that they were frequently disgusting. "Sorry," the boy said. "Don't apologize for physical reactions," Arcturus said. "It's undignified. Do you feel better?" The boy considered the question with evident sincerity. "A bit," he said. "Where is this?" "Grimmauld Place. London. This is your home now." Arcturus straightened and looked at the door of number 12, which appeared to non-magical eyes as a gap between two buildings, a nothing, a shadow between number 11 and number 13. "Come." He watched the boy look at the door, which had appeared for him without a moment's hesitation, the house recognizing the blood in his veins, with wide eyes and an open mouth and the pure, unguarded wonder that Arcturus had almost forgotten children were capable of. He filed that expression away somewhere. He was not sure why. Inside, Creature appeared within moments, enormous eyes fixed on the small figure at Arcturus's side with an expression of undisguised shock, not the supernatural kind but the entirely ordinary kind, the shock of seeing something you hadn't expected and weren't prepared for. "The young master," Creature said, and his voice had done something strange, some roughening that he covered immediately with a deep bow. "Creature will prepare rooms." "The east wing," Arcturus said. "The room with the garden view. And have the kitchen send up soup. Something simple. The boy looks like he hasn't eaten properly in a week." He felt rather than saw the small hand tighten slightly around his fingers at the mention of food. He did not look down. He simply kept walking, letting the child keep pace, through the grand entrance hall with its black marble floors and its ancestral portraits and its wall sconces burning with cold blue fire. He felt the boy's wonder like a physical thing. Every few steps, the small hand would tighten fractionally, and he knew without looking that there was something new to stare at, the portrait of Phineas Nigellus who was watching them pass with sharp intelligent eyes and saying nothing for once, the tapestry of the Black family tree in its full terrible glory on the east wall, the grand staircase that spiraled upward in dark polished wood. "Is it haunted?" the boy asked. They had reached the foot of the stairs. "It has portraits," Arcturus said. "Portraits are not ghosts. They are echoes. There is a difference." "What kind of difference?" "Ghosts are what's left when a person cannot let go of life. Portraits are what's left when a person understands the value of memory." He started up the stairs and felt the boy climb with him, still holding his hand, steps careful and deliberate. "The portraits in this house are the memories of your ancestors. Some of them are insufferable. Most of them are useful. You will learn to tell the difference." The boy was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are my mum and dad portraits?" The question landed in Arcturus's chest and stayed there. "No," he said, after a moment. "Your parents are buried at Godric's Hollow. They were not given portraits. That was an oversight that I intend to correct." Another moment. The small hand was very warm. "They died," the boy said. "Not a question. Not grief, or rather, not yet grief, because you could not grieve what you had never been allowed to fully understand. Just fact, stated with the flatness of a child who had been given information without the emotional scaffolding to hold it." "Yes," Arcturus said. "Were they brave?" He thought of James Potter, who he had never liked, and Lily Potter née Evans, who he had never met, and the wreckage they had left behind that had ended up in a cupboard under a staircase in Surrey. "Exceptionally," he said. The boy nodded once, as though this settled something, and said nothing more until they reached the east wing room where Creature had already turned the lights on and drawn back the curtains, and where there was a view of the narrow private garden below that caught the morning light and turned it unexpectedly golden. The boy stood in the doorway for a moment looking in at the room, at the bed, which was large and soft and covered in dark green and silver, and then he looked up at Arcturus with those Doria green eyes and said, very quietly, "Is this just for me?" "Everything in this wing is yours," Arcturus said. "The room, the bathroom adjacent to it, the study beyond that. Creature will show you." The boy stepped inside. Then he turned back, one hand on the doorframe, with an expression that Arcturus could not entirely read, too old for his face, too careful, too watched. "Mr. Black," he said. "You will call me grandfather," Arcturus said. He had not planned to say that. The word came out clean and final, the way his decisions always came out, though this one surprised him slightly more than most. The green eyes were very bright. "Grandfather," the boy said, trying the word, "am I staying?" "Yes." "For always?" Arcturus held the boy's gaze for a moment that felt, in that quiet room with the golden morning light, somewhat longer than it was. "For always," he said. Creature brought soup and bread and a plate of fruit that the boy ate with the focused intensity of something that had been hungry for a very long time. Arcturus sat across from him in the East Wing's small sitting room and watched him eat and thought about what came next with the same methodical clarity he applied to everything. The boy needed clothes. He needed a healer. The bruise on his jaw was the most visible evidence, but the Muggle clothing and the careful way he moved suggested there was more than one reason to be thorough. He needed, above all else, time. Time and safety and the structural certainty that neither was going to be revoked at short notice. Arcturus had some understanding, professional if not personal, of what sustained instability did to a developing mind, and he intended to repair as much of the damage as could be repaired before other concerns intruded. There would be other concerns. Dumbledore, chief among them. The old man had placed the child in that house and had presumably had some reason that he considered sufficient, and he would have opinions about its removal. Arcturus was prepared to receive those opinions and then explain, in the particular way he had developed over 80 years of being Arcturus Black, why they were immaterial. There were also the matters of legal custody, which would require ministry filings, and the matter of blood protections, which would require some care in transition, and the matter of the Dark Lord who was not entirely gone and who had a habit of coming back. All of this was manageable. All of it was simply work. But first. "What do they call you?" he asked. The boy looked up from his soup. He had eaten half the bread already. "Harry," he said. "Harry," Arcturus repeated. "Your father named you James Harry Potter. Your grandmother Doria was born Doria Black before she married Charles Potter, which makes you blood of my house through her line. You are Harry Potter, and you will also be Hadrian Black-Potter. Both are yours. You will decide, when you are older, which you prefer in which company." Harry, Hadrian, looked at him steadily. Then he said, "Hadrian's a big name." "It is a name from history," Arcturus said. "An emperor. A builder. A man who understood that the best defense is a great wall built from the labor of knowing your enemy's geography." He paused. "You may find it useful." The boy was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can I be Harry still?" "For now." "For now," Arcturus said. "Eat your soup." The boy ate his soup. And Arcturus Black, who had outlived a wife and a son and more friends than he cared to count, who had watched his house splinter and his bloodline scatter, who had spent the last 4 years sitting with the knowledge that somewhere in Surrey there was a child of his blood and telling himself that Dumbledore knew best and that it was not his place to interfere, Arcturus Black sat in the morning light and listened to the small sounds of a child eating, and felt something shifting in his chest. That he hadn't felt move in a very long time. He did not name it. He was not ready to name it yet. The healer's name was Aldous Pruitt, a private practitioner who owed Arcturus 3 favors going back to 1979 and who had the additional virtue of absolute discretion. He arrived that afternoon, a compact gray-haired man with a healer's bag and the professional neutrality of someone who had seen enough of the world's worst behavior to be difficult to shock. He examined Harry in the East Wing sitting room while Arcturus sat in a chair nearby and read a document that he was not actually reading. The healer's face remained professionally blank throughout, but Arcturus watched his hands, the small pauses, the fractional hesitations at certain points of examination, and understood from them what the final report would say before Pruitt had spoken a word. 3 healed fractures, the healer said quietly when Harry had fallen asleep on the sitting room couch, exhausted in the absolute way of small children, 2 of which were never properly set. Consistent malnutrition over an extended period, he's small for his age and underweight. The bruising on his face is from a blow, recent, consistent with a large hand. There are older scars. He paused. Arcturus. What do you want to do with this? I am doing it, Arcturus said, and it is done. I want a full written report. And then? And then I want it filed in 3 separate places, my personal records, Gringotts under the Black family vault secondary documents, and a sealed file at the Ministry in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement under the name of Counselor Moody, whom I trust to keep it without acting on it unless I direct him to. He turned a page of the document he wasn't reading. If anyone ever suggests that I acted improperly in removing that child from that house, I want the world to understand what I removed him from. The healer was quiet for a moment. You're building a case. I am building the truth, Arcturus said. The case builds itself. After Pruitt left, Arcturus sat for a while in the dimming light of the East Wing, listening to Harry breathe, slow and even and finally safe. The boy had a small fist tucked under his chin as he slept, hair in his face, and he looked his age in a way that he hadn't while he was awake and being careful. Arcturus picked up a blanket from the back of the couch, Creature had appeared and disappeared without being asked, as was his way, and laid it over the sleeping child, and went to his study to begin writing letters. The first was to Dumbledore. It was 3 sentences long and very polite and said everything it needed to say and nothing it did not need to say, which was the Black way. Albus, I have taken custody of Harry Potter, who was found in conditions unworthy of a child of magical blood and unworthy of your judgment. The blood wards have been transferred to Grimmauld Place under the Black family's protections, which are considerably older and stronger than anything tied to a Muggle household. I suggest you reflect carefully before contesting this, as I have documentation that you would not find comfortable in public circulation. Arcturus Black. The second letter was to the Ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement, formally registering the custody transfer and attaching the first portion of Pruitt's report. The third letter was to Gringotts, notifying them that the heir of the Potter line was now resident at Grimmauld Place and requesting a full accounting of the Potter family vaults, which had presumably been sitting unmanaged for 4 years. He had a suspicion about that too, and his suspicions were usually right, and he was becoming increasingly angry in the cold clean way that preceded action. The fourth letter was to Regulus. This one took longer. Regulus was alive, barely, 2 years ago, when Creature had found him in a cave on the coast of Scotland, half drowned and poisoned from a dark artifact and too stubborn to die even when death would have been the reasonable option. Arcturus had brought him home and put a healer on him for 6 months and had not asked questions for a further 3 because that was what the situation required. When Regulus had eventually explained what he had done, the locket, the cave, the understanding he had arrived at about Voldemort's soul, Arcturus had sat with the information for a week before acknowledging that his younger grandson had, in whatever misguided self-destructive way, tried to do something right. Regulus was living quietly in the Black estate in Wiltshire under a Fidelius charm, officially dead, which suited him well enough. He was 32 years old and permanently scarred down one side from the inferi and quiet in a way he had not been quiet as a boy. He spent most of his time reading and occasionally writing correspondence that Arcturus reviewed and that concerned dark artifact identification and the theoretical deconstruction of soul magic. He was, in other words, precisely the right person to help raise a child who might one day have to face a dark lord who had done things to his own soul that defied conventional understanding. Regulus, Arcturus wrote, I have removed Harry Potter from the Dursley household in Surrey. He is 4 years old, in poor health, and has the look of our family about him. I intend to raise him as a Black, in full understanding of what he is and what he will face. I am also intending to pursue, through legal channels, the release of Sirius from Azkaban. I have always believed him innocent and I now have both the motive and the resources to act on that belief. I am writing to ask whether you would consider returning to London. Not permanently if you prefer it otherwise, and not openly. Your existing situation can be maintained, but the child needs more than I can offer alone, and you are the best mind in this family for the particular knowledge he will require. Furthermore, I believe you have been alone with your guilt for long enough. Come home, Regulus. Your grandfather, Arcturus. He sealed all 4 letters and sent them. Then he went back to the east wing and sat in the chair across from the sleeping child and allowed himself, very quietly, in the privacy of the room and the failing light, to be furious. Not the hot rushing fury of young men, he had burned through that decades ago, but the deep still anger of someone who had understood too late that standing back and trusting the right people to manage things was not always wisdom. Sometimes it was negligence dressed in the clothing of deference. 4 years. The boy had been in that cupboard for 4 years and Arcturus had known where he was and done nothing because Dumbledore had his reasons and those reasons were probably good ones and it was not Arcturus's place. He looked at Harry's sleeping face. The bruise along his jaw. The too large clothing. The way he had asked, with such careful steadiness, "Is this just for me?" He would not make that mistake again. Dumbledore's response arrived the following morning, and it was, in its way, exactly what Arcturus had expected. The letter was warm and measured and deeply, structurally manipulative, each paragraph wrapped in concern for Harry's well-being while steering, with the practiced inevitability of a man who had been moving pieces on a board for decades, toward the argument that the blood protections tied to Petunia Dursley's house were irreplaceable, that Harry's safety depended on his anonymity, that the arrangements in Surrey, while admittedly not ideal, were. Arcturus stopped reading at not ideal. He put the letter down and looked at the word ideal for a long moment. Then he went to his study, drafted a response of precisely 4 sentences including a reference to the healer's report and a polite but absolute note that any attempt to contest the custody transfer through either magical or ministry channels would result in said report, along with the 4 years' worth of suppressed accidental magic logs, becoming publicly available, and send it back by return owl. He did not hear from Dumbledore again for 11 days. When the next letter came it was shorter, and it contained something that, from Albus Dumbledore, constituted an extraordinary concession, acknowledgement. Arcturus, I cannot pretend that what the boy experienced in that house was anything other than a failure on my part. My calculations were made in haste after a night of extraordinary grief, and I weighted certain factors, the blood magic, the anonymity, Voldemort's remaining supporters, above others. I see now that I was wrong to do so, and I tell you this not to seek absolution but because I believe you deserve honesty. I ask only one thing, that you allow the boy to have as normal a childhood as your family's particular circumstances allow, and that you permit me, when the time comes, to speak with him about what he is and what he may be asked to face. Albus Arcturus read this twice. Then he wrote back, he will be raised to know exactly what he is. On the matter of what he may be asked to face, I suggest you consider that what you will find, when the time comes, is not a boy who needs to be told things but a young man who has already been prepared. Whether that is the shape of your plan or not is, I fear, no longer your concern. He was not, he decided, being cruel. He was being clear. There was a difference, and it was a difference that mattered. Regulus arrived on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the letter. He came by float, appearing in the study fireplace with the slightly controlled unsteadiness of someone who had been traveling for a while and was tired, and he stopped in the doorway of the study looking at Arcturus with those dark eyes that were so like Sirius's and so unlike them, quieter, more contained, carrying a weight that Sirius had never quite developed the patience to accumulate. He had the scar, still, one side of his face and down his neck, the kind of thing a glamour could cover but which Regulus did not bother covering when he was at home. He was thin in a way that concerned Arcturus somewhat and well-dressed in a way that suggested he still maintained standards, which was reassuring. "Grandfather," he said. "Sit down," Arcturus said. Tea. Creature appeared with tea before the word was properly finished, and Regulus lowered himself into the chair across from the desk and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at Arcturus. "How is he?" Regulus asked. "Better than he was," Arcturus said. "The healer has seen him twice. He's eating well now and gaining weight. He has Creature convinced that he requires 3 substantial meals a day and 2 small ones, which Creature agrees with completely and with great enthusiasm." A pause. "He is curious. Relentlessly curious. He asks questions from the moment he wakes up until the moment Creature insists on lights out, and most of his questions are very good ones." Regulus was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't know what happened to his parents. What he is. He knows his parents died. He knows they were brave. He knows he is a Black-Potter and what that means in terms of family." Arcturus turned his teacup on its saucer. "He does not yet know about Voldemort. He does not yet know about the prophecy. He will know both, in time, and he will be prepared for both. But he is 4 years old and he has spent 4 years in a cupboard. There is a correct order to things." Regulus nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you know about soul magic. Everything you know about dark artifacts and their identification and destruction. The theoretical framework will need to dismantle what Voldemort has done to himself." Arcturus met his grandson's eyes. "And your company, Regulus. The boy needs family." "So do I." The silence that followed was the kind that carried things in it. Then Regulus said, very quietly, "I wasn't sure I thought perhaps after everything I did, the mark, the Death Eaters, you tried to fix what you broke," Arcturus said, with the flat finality of a man closing a door on a finished argument. "It almost killed you. You have been punishing yourself in that estate for 2 years. That is sufficient." He met Regulus's eyes. "You are home, and you are needed. These 2 facts are enough." Regulus looked at his tea for a moment. His jaw was tight in the way it had been tight since he was 17 and discovered that the world was not what he thought it was. Then something in it loosened, fractionally, and he breathed out. "All right," he said. "All right, then." They had tea in the study until the late afternoon, when the sound of small feet in the corridor preceded the door opening approximately 6 inches to reveal one very green eye and a quantity of extremely disordered black hair. Harry looked at Regulus with the careful assessment that Arcturus was already learning to recognize, the measuring, the weighting, the decision held in reserve. "Grandfather," Harry said, "Creature says dinner is ready and that if you don't come now the soup will be sad." "Creature is correct on both counts," Arcturus said. "Harry, this is Regulus. He is your family and he will be staying with us. Come in and greet him properly." Harry pushed the door open the rest of the way and came in. He looked at Regulus for a moment, at the scar, which he noted with the direct guileless attention of small children, filing it away, drawing no audible conclusion about it, and then he said, "Are you the kind of family that hugs or the kind that doesn't?" Regulus blinked, and for the first time in what Arcturus suspected was a very long time, he laughed. A real laugh, rough and surprised. "What kind of question is that?" "Grandfather is the kind that doesn't," Harry said, with the certainty of a child who has conducted research, "but I wanted to know which kind you are before I decided." Regulus looked at Arcturus, who was observing all of this with the neutral expression of a man who is deeply entertained and would never admit it. "I'm a work in progress," Regulus said, "on the hugging question." Harry considered this. "That's all right," he said. "Me too." Then he looked at Arcturus. "Can I sit next to the new one at dinner?" "Regulus has a name," Arcturus said. "Use it." "Can I sit next to Regulus at dinner?" "You may ask Regulus." Harry turned to Regulus with an expression of total sincerity. "Can I sit next to you at dinner?" Regulus looked at this small person, this child who was somehow James Potter and Lily Evans and the Black family all in one, who asked very good questions and had apparently adopted his ancient terrifying grandfather without apparent difficulty, who was looking at him now with the same direct green gaze that had, by all accounts, once faced down Lord Voldemort and survived. And something in him that had been closed for a very long time did something unexpected and opened. "Yes," Regulus said. "You can sit next to me at dinner." They went downstairs together, the old man and his damaged grandson and the small boy who was, in ways none of them could fully see yet, going to change everything, and Kreacher had indeed made soup, and it was not sad at all. In the weeks that followed, a routine established itself with the quiet inevitability of water finding level. Arcturus was not a man who had ever operated without structure, and he applied structure to the raising of Harry the way he applied it to everything, methodically, with clear purpose, and with the underlying conviction that the most loving thing one could do for a child was to prepare them comprehensively for the world they were going to inhabit. This did not mean he was harsh. It was a distinction he was careful to maintain, because he understood, more than he might once have, that there was a version of the Black family's education that produced Regulus, who had made terrible choices and survived them and come out the other side with some integrity intact, and a version that produced something else, something closed and cold that could not find its way back. He did not intend to produce the latter. Harry ate his 3 meals and 2 small ones and grew, visibly and quickly, in the way of children who have been food deprived and then given reliable access to enough. Within a month he had outgrown everything Arcturus had bought him initially and they had gone back to the Muggle shops. He was too young for Diagon Alley's attention, not yet, and bought more. Harry had strong opinions about his clothes, which Arcturus found entirely reasonable. He liked green and dark blue and things with pockets. He slept in his room every night, which he had not done for the first few weeks. For the first few weeks he had woken in the night and it took Arcturus, who slept lightly, an old man's habit, approximately 45 seconds to realize that the small sounds he was hearing through the walls were Harry trying very hard not to make any sounds, because he had learned that sounds brought consequences, and that this learning needed to be gently and systematically unlearned. He had gone to the boy's room on the 4th night and said, simply, "You are allowed to be heard in this house. You will not be punished for existing." And then he had sat in the chair by the window until Harry went back to sleep, which took a while, and he had done this for as many nights as were needed. By the end of the 2nd month, Harry slept through the night. By the end of the 3rd, he had taken to shouting for Kreacher from 3 rooms away, which was unnecessary given that Kreacher would appear regardless, but which represented a development that Arcturus chose to view as entirely positive. Regulus, who had been quiet and careful with the boy in the beginning, careful in the way of someone not quite sure they deserved to be warmly received, had by the 4th month become Harry's primary source of information about magic, because Harry asked Regulus approximately 40 questions a day and Regulus answered all of them with the exact right mixture of seriousness and wonder. He had always been better than serious at explaining things. He had been better than most people at explaining things, if Arcturus was being truthful about it. "Grandfather," Harry said one morning at breakfast, 6 months in, approaching Arcturus's end of the table with the cautious directness of a child who has prepared an argument. He was 4.5 now, and already clearly going to be tall. "Grandfather, Regulus says I can't do magic yet because I'm not trained, but I already do magic. I do it by accident, so it seems like if I'm doing it anyway I should learn to do it on purpose." Arcturus looked at him over the prophet. "And what does Regulus say to that?" "He says I should ask you." A pause. "But he was smiling when he said it, so I think he agrees with me and just wants you to be the one to decide." Arcturus put the prophet down. He looked at his great-great-grandchild, who had his arms crossed in a posture of 4-year-old patience and determination and who was looking back at him with absolute sincerity. "What kind of magic have you done accidentally?" Arcturus asked. "I made a plant grow fast when I was in the garden," Harry said. "And I made Kreacher's tea go to the right temperature when it was too hot and he was going to burn his hands. And once when I fell off the library step stool I didn't hit the floor, I just stopped. And there was the time that a dog was chasing me at the Dursleys and I ended up on top of the garden shed." He said the last one with the tone of someone reporting a historical incident, its emotional content firmly stored somewhere else. Arcturus was quiet for a moment. The variety of those incidents, temperature regulation, growth acceleration, levitation, instinctive self-preservation, was not the picture of a child with ordinary magical potential. It was the picture of something considerably more. "I will discuss it with Regulus," Arcturus said. "You will have an answer by this evening." Harry considered this. Is that a yes that's being polite about being a yes, or is it a no that's being polite about being a no? Arcturus looked at the boy for a moment. "Where did you learn to ask that question?" "From you," Harry said simply. "You do that sometimes. With letters." Arcturus picked up the prophet again. "It is a yes that is taking the morning to become a yes," he said. "Go eat your toast." Harry went back to his end of the table with a small private smile that he was not bothering to hide, which meant he had learned, in 6 months, that Arcturus wasn't going to punish him for being pleased about things. This struck Arcturus, later that morning while he was in his study doing something entirely unrelated, as one of the most significant developments of the last 6 months. The boy was learning to trust. Not the desperate fragile trust of a child who had no choice, but the solid grounded kind, the kind built on pattern and consistency, on being told a thing and having it be true, on discovering that the people around you are not variables but constants. He was learning, in other words, that he was safe. And he was learning it without losing the sharpness, the watchfulness, the quality of paying deep and careful attention that the Dursleys household had forged in him. The Blacks were good at that, at holding safety and alertness at the same time, at being warm and private and formidable everywhere else. Harry Potter Black was going to be formidable. Arcturus had known it when the boy had looked at him from the back of the cupboard with those measuring green eyes. He knew it more firmly with every week that passed. He called Regulus into his study that afternoon and they talked for 2 hours about the theoretical framework of controlled magical education for pre-Hogwarts children, which was technically regulated by the ministry but which had enough exceptions for private tutorship within a family that Arcturus could do it legally if he chose and illegally if he chose, either way with equal confidence. They began Harry's education the following Monday. They started simply. Not with wand work, that would wait until he was older, but with theory, with the understanding of what magic was, where it lived, how it moved. Regulus was the primary teacher for magical theory. Arcturus took the history himself, because there was no one he trusted more than himself to give the boy the unvarnished version of what the wizarding world looked like, who held power and why, which institutions could be trusted and which were performance, and what it meant to be heir to one of the oldest magical houses in Britain. He did not make it a lecture. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that Harry's questions made the history interesting again in the way it hadn't been since Arcturus was young enough to be discovering it himself. The boy asked why constantly, in the way that only children and very honest adults ask why, and it forced Arcturus to examine assumptions he had long since stopped examining. Why is pure blood important? Harry asked one afternoon, sitting at the study table with a book on wizarding history open in front of him that he was clearly not looking at. Some people believe it is because concentrated magical lineage produces stronger magic, Arcturus said, from behind his desk. This is partially true and largely overstated. Harry looked at him. And you? I believe that lineage is important because of what it carries, Arcturus said. Not blood in the crude biological sense, but knowledge. History. Obligation. The memory of what your family has done and therefore the understanding of what you are responsible for. He paused. Your mother was Muggle-born. She was also, by all credible accounts, one of the most gifted witches of her generation. The two facts are entirely compatible. Do you understand the distinction I'm drawing? Harry thought about it with the focused seriousness he brought to questions he considered important. You care about the knowledge more than the blood. I care about the accountability that the knowledge creates, Arcturus said. A Black who does not know what this house has done, the good and the terrible of it, is not a Black. A Black who knows it and takes no responsibility for it is worse than nothing. You are going to know all of it. Every piece. And you are going to decide, with full information, what kind of man you want to be. Harry looked at him steadily. What kind of man are you? The question sat in the air between them for a moment. "I am the kind of man who sat back and trusted the wrong person when I should have acted," Arcturus said, "and who is trying, at a very advanced age, to correct that." He held the boy's gaze. "I am also the kind of man who does not make the same mistake twice." Harry nodded, slowly, as though taking that in and filing it somewhere important. He was nearly 5 years old. He understood more than was comfortable for a child his age, because understanding was a survival skill he had been developing since before he had the vocabulary for it. Arcturus did not try to make him less aware or less analytical. He tried, instead, to give the awareness and the analysis a foundation of knowledge wide enough that the weight of what the boy understood would be properly distributed. Love, he was discovering, not naming it yet, but circling it, was a great deal of work. It was nothing like the portrait suggested. It was nothing like the poets wrote. It was, he was finding, a great deal like management, constant, specific, responsive to changing conditions, expensive of energy and attention, and absolutely necessary. He was not sorry for any of it. The boy fell asleep that evening at the study table over his history book, and Creature took him up to bed with the tender efficiency of a creature who had loved this family when there was no one left to love and was now, clearly, loving it again with everything he had. Arcturus watched from the study doorway as Creature tucked the quilt around Harry's sleeping form and then stood at the foot of the bed for a moment with his enormous hands folded and his enormous eyes very bright. "Creature," Arcturus said quietly. "Master Arcturus," Creature said, turning. "He is ours now," Arcturus said. "Completely and without reservation. You understand what that means?" Creature stood a little straighter. "Creature understands," he said, with the gravity of a creature for whom belonging was the entirety of identity. "Creature will protect the young master. Always." "Good," Arcturus said. He went back to his study. He had letters to write. There was still Sirius to deal with, his older grandson, wrongly imprisoned for almost 4 years, and the work of extracting him from Azkaban was going to require patience and precision and the willingness to be quietly devastating to several people's reputations. He was entirely prepared for all 3. He picked up his pen. Outside, London settled into night, and deep in Grimmauld Place, under a quilt in a room with a garden view, the heir of House Black slept without nightmares for the first time in longer than he could remember, while the portraits of his ancestors watched over him in the dark and said nothing at all, because some things needed no words, and some things had been worth waiting for, and some things were, at last, finally, against all odds, exactly right. Chapter 2, The Education of Hadrian Black. The first time Harry moved something on purpose, he was 5 years old and deeply annoyed about a book. It was on the top shelf of the library, the East Library, the smaller one off the corridor near his bedroom that Arcturus had designated as Harry's to use freely, and it had a green spine and gold lettering that read mythological creatures of the ancient magical world, and it was exactly the book Harry wanted because Regulus had mentioned sea serpents at breakfast and Harry had 17 questions about sea serpents and the book was right there, except that it was 6 feet off the ground and Harry was not. He had tried the step stool. The step stool reached the 4th shelf. The book was on the 6th shelf. He had considered stacking other books on the step stool and dismissed this as unstable. He had considered waiting until Regulus or Arcturus came past and dismissed this as slow. He had stood at the foot of the shelf for approximately 3 minutes, looking up at the green spine, wanting it with the specific focused intensity of a child who has decided on a thing. The book came off the shelf and floated down into his hands. Harry stood there for a moment holding it, feeling something warm and bright moving through him the way it had moved when he'd made Creature's tea cool, and when the plant in the garden had grown, and when he'd stopped himself from hitting the floor from the step stool, except this time it wasn't reactive, it was his, he had reached for it and it had come, like calling a dog and having it actually come. He went to find Regulus immediately. Regulus was in the downstairs study, which he had adopted as his workspace, surrounded by books and parchment and with an ink stain on his left hand that had been there for 3 days. He looked up when Harry appeared in the doorway. "I did it on purpose," Harry said. Regulus put down his quill. "Show me." Harry set the sea serpent book on Regulus's desk, took 3 steps back, looked at it, and reached for that warm bright thing in his chest. The book slid across the desk and stopped at the edge. Again, Regulus said. Harry brought it back. Regulus was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Harry with an expression Harry had learned to read over the past months as I am thinking several things at once and prioritizing them. Then he said, "You're not pushing it. You're not, it's not an effort in the way it should be. You're calling it. Is that different?" Harry asked. "It's very different." Regulus stood up. "Come on. Let's go tell grandfather." They found Arcturus in the upper dining room writing letters. Arcturus was always writing letters. Harry had decided that letters were approximately half of being in charge of a great house and the other half was having very long conversations over tea, and Regulus said, "He's doing directed wandless telekinesis. Intentional, controlled, effortless." Arcturus put down his pen. He looked at Harry, who looked back. "Show me," Arcturus said. Harry looked at the teacup in front of Arcturus. He called it. The cup slid 2 inches to the left, smooth and precise. He brought it back. Then, because he had been thinking about the book on the way down the corridor, he tried something different. He called it up, lifting, and the cup rose 6 inches off the table and hung there, perfectly steady, while all the tea stayed inside because Harry was thinking about the tea too, thinking stay. Arcturus looked at the floating cup for a long moment. "Put it down," he said. The cup descended and settled without a sound. Arcturus looked at Regulus, who was doing something complicated with his mouth that was probably not a smile but was also definitely a smile. Then he looked back at Harry. "We are going to need to revise your education schedule," Arcturus said. "Considerably." Harry allowed himself a small, private grin. The years did what years did when they were full, they moved quickly. Harry grew into himself by increments that Arcturus tracked with the careful attention of a man who had learned, later than he should have, what it meant to pay attention. By 6, he was reading materials written for children twice his age and asking questions about them written for adults. By 7, he had developed a wandless capability for minor spell work, temperature, light manipulation, small kinetic work, that was controlled enough to be used practically rather than accidentally. By 8, he was conducting theoretical discussions about magic with Regulus that Arcturus sat in on occasionally and emerged from feeling cautiously proud. The boy was extraordinary. Arcturus did not say this out loud. He said it, instead, in the ways available to him, in the quality of the tutors he engaged, in the books he sourced from the restricted sections of 4 different private libraries, in the hours he spent in the evenings when Harry's lesson was done sitting across from him and playing wizard chess, which Harry lost consistently until he was 7 and then won consistently thereafter, which told Arcturus more about the development of his strategic mind than any formal assessment could. He brought in tutors for the things he and Regulus couldn't cover. A retired auror named Cecily Thornton for basic combat fundamentals and physical conditioning. Arcturus believed firmly that a sharp mind in a weak body was half-armored at best. A goblin scholar named Rickert for mathematics and Gringotts standard financial literacy, because there was not a single person in the history of the Black family who had been made weaker by understanding exactly where money came from and where it went. A linguist from the Department of Magical Languages for Latin and Greek, which were the bones of most incantation structures and which Harry absorbed with the irritating ease of a child whose brain was built for pattern recognition. He also engaged, quietly and through channels that Dumbledore would not see, a private researcher named Septima Vane to compile a comprehensive dossier on Lord Voldemort's activities, known associates, magical methodology, and theoretical soul work. This document lived in Arcturus's safe along with Pruitt's healer report and the suppressed accidental magic logs and was not something Harry was given access to yet. But it was being built, carefully, for the day when access would be the appropriate step. Regulus contributed everything else. He taught Harry occlumency beginning at age 7, not because there was an immediate threat to Harry's mind but because Regulus believed, and had said so with a directness Arcturus had found both alarming and correct, that a child who had spent 4 years being completely unprotected in every possible way should be given the tools to make his own mind his own sovereign territory as early as possible. Harry had taken to it with the same focused intensity he took to everything he decided to master, which was everything. By 8 he had a basic shielded mind. By 9 it was structural, layered, organized, deceptive in the way that the best occlumency was deceptive, giving a surface that felt real while the truth sat several floors below it. "He's better than me already," Regulus told Arcturus one evening, after Harry had gone to bed. They were in Arcturus's study with 2 glasses of fire whiskey, Regulus drinking his, Arcturus holding his in the way of a man who wants the smell more than the content. "He is better than you in the way a child prodigy is better than their teacher," Arcturus said. "He is not yet better than you in the way that matters, which is judgment. He has the walls but not yet the wisdom of when to lower them." Regulus turned his glass on the arm of his chair. "He's starting to understand what's coming. He doesn't say it but you can see it when he works, there's a purpose to how he approaches everything. He's not learning for the sake of learning. He's learning for the sake of being ready. He was always going to understand it," Arcturus said. "Children who survive difficult circumstances develop threat assessment early. He is simply being thorough about it." He set down his fire whiskey. "When he is 9. We will begin to tell him more of it." Regulus looked at him steadily. "And Sirius?" The name sat between them. The matter of Sirius had been Arcturus's ongoing project for 3 years, pursued with the same patient inexorability he applied to everything that mattered. He had engaged a solicitor named Montgomery Wells who specialized in wrongful imprisonment cases and who had reviewed the evidence against Sirius, the entire evidence, or rather the startling paucity of it, and produced a brief that Arcturus found compelling enough to take to Amelia Bones directly, over the heads of the several layers of ministry bureaucracy that had been content to leave Sirius Black in Azkaban forever. The process had been slow. Bones was honest but not reckless. She wanted testimony, not just documentation, and testimony required witnesses, and witnesses in the Black family's case required either Pettigrew, who had successfully faked his own death, or a pensive reconstruction from someone who had been present at the scene. Arcturus had provided the latter through the Longbottom's memory records. Augusta had been thorough about the documentation, and Neville's parents had given statements before they were incapacitated, and had also, through a combination of influence and the very selective sharing of information, convinced Amelia Bones that allowing a wrongful imprisonment to stand was not just unjust but a ministry liability she did not want when it eventually surfaced publicly. They were close. The hearing was scheduled for April. Harry would be 9 in July. "Sirius will be home before Harry's birthday," Arcturus said. "That was always the timing I was working toward." Regulus was quiet. He and Sirius had not spoken since before the war. Before everything, the break between them was not the dramatic kind, not the shouting and the burning off the tapestry kind that Sirius had had with their mother, but the quieter and more terrible kind, the kind where 2 people go in different directions and then one of them dies, officially, and the gap becomes permanent. Regulus had spent 2 years in Wiltshire believing that death was simply what he deserved, and part of what he was owed was the permanent loss of a brother he had failed to fight alongside. "He's going to be angry," Regulus said. "When he gets out. He has 5 years of Azkaban to be angry about," Arcturus said. "He is entitled. He's going to be angry at me specifically. Possibly." Arcturus looked at his grandson with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who had watched both his grandsons grow up and loved them in the way difficult men loved difficult things, with absolute commitment and very little demonstration. "You will endure it. And then it will pass. You are both still alive, which is more than either of you planned on, and you are both in this house, which means you will eventually find your way to each other. The Black family has not survived 3 centuries by being incapable of reconciliation." Regulus made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something less comfortable. "Besides," Arcturus said, with a dryness that he allowed himself in private, "Harry will manage it. Harry's 8. Harry is going to be the kind of person who manages things that are considerably larger than a family dispute," Arcturus said. "You'll see. Harry found out about Sirius in the spring, before the hearing, because he found a letter. He was not snooping, not exactly. He had been in Arcturus's study looking for a specific volume on ancient runes that Arcturus had mentioned at breakfast and thought he'd left on the corner of his desk, and the desk was covered in papers and the letter was on top, unsealed, because Arcturus had already sent the sealed version and this was his own copy, and the name Sirius Orient Black, Azkaban Prison. Cell 12 was written at the top in Arcturus's precise hand and Harry had stopped moving entirely when he saw it. He read it. He was not proud of this but he read it, because information was how you understood things and he could not unknow the name once he'd seen it, and the letter was 3 pages of careful legal argument that built, by the end, to a single stark and quiet sentence. My grandson has been in Azkaban for nearly 5 years for a crime he did not commit, and I intend to see him released before the year is out. Harry put the letter back exactly where he'd found it. He did not find the book on ancient runes. He went to find Regulus. Regulus was in the garden. It was an early spring day, the kind where the light was good but the air hadn't caught up, sitting on the bench near the old yew tree with a book face down on his knee, which meant he was thinking rather than reading. He looked up when Harry came out. Sirius Black, Harry said. Is your brother? Regulus went very still. He's in Azkaban, Harry said. And he's innocent. Regulus looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, You read the letter. I found the letter, Harry said. It was on top of the desk. I'm sorry. A pause. Regulus picked up his book and set it aside. Sit down. Harry sat on the other end of the bench. The yew tree was very old and very dark above them and the garden smelled of early soil and stone. Sirius was accused of betraying your parents to Voldemort, Regulus said. He was also accused of killing 13 Muggles and a wizard named Peter Pettigrew. He was imprisoned without a trial. Without a trial, Harry repeated. Without a trial. Harry processed this with the specific quiet intensity that had become, over the years, one of his defining expressions. He thought about it for what felt like a long time but was probably only a minute. Then he said, He was my parents' friend. Their best friend, Regulus said. He and your father were as close as, yes. And you're his brother. Yes. But you were a Death Eater, Harry said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without drama, not as an accusation. Yes, Regulus said. For 2 years. I was 17 when I took the mark. He paused. I was an idiot who believed things I shouldn't have believed, and then I saw what those things actually meant in practice and I tried to do something about it and it almost killed me. He looked at Harry with the directness they had developed between them over 4 years of lessons and meals and long evenings in the study. You know I'm not making excuses. I know, Harry said. I just want to understand the whole thing. Sirius and I were on opposite sides of the war, Regulus said. He fought for the right reasons. I fought for the wrong ones. He ended up in Azkaban anyway, which is, it's not just. A pause. It's not just, and grandfather has been working to fix it, and I should have been helping him sooner than I have been, but it's complicated, when it's your brother. Harry looked at his hands. He was thinking something, working through it, and Regulus waited the way Arcturus had taught him by example, not filling the silence, letting it be productive. When he gets out, Harry said, is he going to be part of the family? Our family? I think so, Regulus said. Yes, that's what grandfather is working toward. Good, Harry said simply. He stood up. I'm going to go ask grandfather to tell me properly. He should have already. I should have known about Sirius. He paused, looked at Regulus with those green eyes that were so unnervingly direct. I should know about all of it. He went inside. Regulus sat in the garden for a while after that, in the early spring light, and thought about what Arcturus had said, you'll see. Arcturus told him everything that evening. Not the edited version, not the age-appropriate version, not the version where the difficult parts were softened with the buffer of context and preparation. Harry had asked for all of it, with the full seriousness of a 9-year-old who had spent 4 years learning that he could handle information and that the people around him were not going to punish him for knowing things, and Arcturus gave him all of it. The Prophecy. The night of October 31st, 1981. James and Lily Potter in Godric's Hollow, and the Secret Keeper, and Pettigrew's betrayal. Voldemort at the door, and what he had done, and the thing that Harry's mother had done that had stopped him, not her death, her choice, the magic of deliberate sacrifice that had left its mark in Harry's own blood and in the scar on his forehead. Voldemort's diminishment. The soul magic that Regulus had uncovered. The Horcruxes. Harry listened to all of it with his hands flat on the table and his face very still, in the way of someone who is experiencing something large and is being careful about it. When Arcturus finished, the study was quiet for a long moment. "He's coming back," Harry said. It wasn't a question. "He is not gone in any final sense," Arcturus said. "He has taken steps to ensure he cannot die in the conventional manner. He will find a way to reconstitute himself. The question is when and how, not whether. And the prophecy says I'm the one who finishes it." "The prophecy says you are the one with the power to do so," Arcturus said carefully. "It says neither that you must do so alone nor that you must do so on anyone else's schedule or by anyone else's method." Harry looked at him. "That's a very specific distinction. It is a very important one." Arcturus met his great-great-grandchild's eyes across the study desk, the old man and the young boy and the weight of everything in the air between them. "Other people, Dumbledore, primarily, have a particular idea of how this story should go. What role you should play in it. What shape the ending should take. I am telling you now, before you walk into any room where he might try to maneuver you, that their plan was built around a boy who had never been prepared. You are not that boy." Harry held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression, not hardness, not quite, but the settling of something into place, the way a stone finds its level on ground. "What's our plan?" Arcturus felt something that might, in a more sentimental person, have been called pride. "We dismantle Voldemort the way one dismantles anything that has been built incorrectly," Arcturus said. "Piece by piece. Starting with the pieces he thinks are hidden." He opened the drawer of his desk and produced the dossier that had been building for 4 years, Septima Vane's research, Regulus's theoretical work, Arcturus's own intelligence from the network of contacts he'd maintained across 4 decades of political life. He placed it on the table in front of Harry. "Start reading. Ask Regulus about anything you don't understand. We have time, not unlimited time, but enough." Harry opened the dossier. He began to read. He was 9 years old. He read for 2 hours without stopping, asking a question at the end of every 3rd or 4th page, and the questions were the right ones. Sirius Black walked out of Azkaban on a Thursday in April, thin and grey and burning with something that had kept itself alive for 5 years in conditions designed to extinguish it. He was not given to the public. The hearing had been conducted quietly, in chambers, in front of a panel of 3 senior Wisengamot members and Amelia Bones, and the verdict had been sealed pending formal announcement at Arcturus's request, which Bones had granted because she owed him 2 favors and because she had her own reasons for wanting the announcement managed carefully. Arcturus went alone to collect him from the Ministry holding suite where they'd brought him after the hearing. He had arranged for a healer already, a different one from Pruitt, a specialist in post-Azkaban recovery, a woman named Dr. Osei who had worked with several Azkaban releases and who had, according to every account, the combination of clinical efficiency and human warmth that such work required. He walked into the holding suite and saw his older grandson for the first time in 6 years. Sirius looked nothing like himself. He looked like a version of himself that had been through something unforgivable and was only partially through the process of deciding whether to be angry about it or destroyed by it. He was thin in the wrong way, not lean but depleted, the muscle of a man who had once been intensely physical worn down to something that was holding on by stubbornness rather than substance. His hair was long and tangled and his eyes were grey and bright, and when he saw Arcturus he didn't speak for a long moment. "You got me out," Sirius said. His voice was rougher than it had been, lower, like an instrument that had been played hard in difficult conditions. "I should have done it 4 years ago," Arcturus said. "Sit down before you fall over." Sirius sat down. He looked like sitting was an act of will rather than choice. They were quiet for a moment. "Harry," Sirius said. "Where is he?" "Is he? When I heard, I thought he was still at the Dursleys. He has been with me at Grimmauld Place for 4 years, Arcturus said. "He is 9 years old, he is in excellent health, he is being educated comprehensively, and he is going to be very glad to meet you." He paused. "And Sirius?" Sirius looked at him. "Regulus is alive." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence entirely. They gave Sirius 2 weeks. 2 weeks of the healer and real food and sleep in a real bed and the particular silence of Grimmauld Place, which was not a comfortable silence but was at least a safe one. He slept a great deal. He ate with the focused necessity of someone replenishing something fundamental. He moved through the house slowly at first, relearning the weight of himself. Harry was not kept from him. Arcturus had considered whether a gradual introduction was appropriate and had rejected it, partly because gradual introductions were generally unnecessary when both parties were straightforward and partly because Harry had been reading about Sirius for a week and had opinions. They met in the kitchen on Sirius's 3rd morning, because Harry had come down early as he always did and found a strange man making tea with the slightly unfocused concentration of someone for whom simple tasks still required deliberate effort. Sirius turned at the sound of footsteps and went very still. Harry looked at him with those green eyes, and Sirius looked at Harry, and the resemblance, James Potter's face and Lily Evans's eyes, unmistakable, unavoidable, moved across Sirius's face like weather. "You're serious," Harry said. "Yeah," Sirius said, with the roughness of a man who was doing something effortful with his voice. "Yeah, I am." "And you're Harry." "Hadrian Black-Potter," Harry said, with the particular precision of someone exercising their full title in an appropriate context. "But Harry's fine." He looked at Sirius for another moment with that measuring consideration. "You were my dad's best friend." "I was," Sirius said. "He was mine." Harry nodded. Then he said, "Do you want me to show you where Creature keeps the good tea? Grandfather only drinks the one kind but there are better ones." Something happened in Sirius's face. It broke, very slightly, in the way of a frozen surface releasing, not shattering, just giving, the first movement of a thaw. "Yeah," he said, voice not entirely steady. "Yeah, show me." Harry opened the correct cabinet without ceremony, produced a tin of Darjeeling that Regulus had brought from somewhere, and told Sirius, with the instructional authority of a child who knows something useful, where Creature kept the good cups. They drank tea at the kitchen table in the early morning, the man and the boy, and by the time Arcturus came downstairs they were discussing, apparently seriously, whether dogs were smarter than cats, which was a debate Harry was conducting from a position of aggressive theoretical neutrality while Sirius defended dogs with the passion of genuine personal investment. Arcturus poured himself his own tea and said nothing and sat down at the end of the table, and this too was a morning he filed away somewhere. The meeting between Sirius and Regulus was not a kitchen conversation over good tea. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in the upper sitting room, arranged by Arcturus with the same precision he arranged everything, both parties told in advance, time and location specified, no ambushes. Regulus had been pacing the East Wing corridor for an hour before it. Sirius had been sitting in the upper sitting room for 20 minutes before Regulus arrived, in the particular stillness of someone who had decided on a position and was holding it against internal weather. Harry knew better than to be in the room. He waited in the corridor with Creature, who was pretending to polish things and was very obviously listening. The conversation inside was not quiet, for the first part of it. It was not the worst version of itself either, there was no cruelty, nothing that could not be unmade, and underneath the anger, which was real and warranted and needed to be expressed rather than buried, there was something else that Harry could hear even through the door, something that the Black family wore very badly and very bravely. The specific grief of brothers who had spent years being on opposite sides of something that had destroyed everyone around them and had decided, in whatever back room of themselves they kept these decisions, that they were not willing to lose each other too. It went on for 2 hours. When Regulus came out, his eyes were red, which he was controlling with the practiced effort of a man who had decided years ago that he would feel what he felt but would choose the times and places. He looked at Harry, who was sitting on the corridor floor with a book he had not been reading. "Don't say anything," Regulus said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Harry said. "Good." Regulus walked past him down the corridor. Then he stopped and, without turning around, said, "Thank you for making him go through proper channels to come home. If grandfather had if it had been a less managed situation, I think Sirius would have, it would have been harder." Harry looked at the back of Regulus's head. "Grandfather managed the situation," he said. "I just happened to be the reason." Regulus made a sound that might have been a laugh. He kept walking. Sirius was in the upper sitting room when Harry went in. He was standing at the window looking out at the London evening, and his posture was the posture of someone who has been through something and is on the other side of it with both parts of themselves intact. He looked at Harry when he came in. "You knew," Sirius said. "About Regulus?" "Grandfather told me everything," Harry said. "I asked him to." "And?" Harry sat down on the window seat and looked up at Sirius. "And you both survived. And you're both here. And grandfather says that's sufficient basis for everything else." Sirius looked at him for a long moment. "How are you this sensible? You're 9. "Grandfather is very educational," Harry said, with a straight face, and Sirius laughed, the real laugh, not the careful one, the one that sounded like who he had been before 5 years in Azkaban had tried to take that away from him. He sat down on the window seat beside Harry, and they looked out at the London evening together, and Harry thought that this was what family felt like when it was working properly, not perfect, not without damage, but present. All the pieces, eventually, finding their way to the same table. By the time Harry was 10, the family at Grimmauld Place had settled into a shape that none of them had planned and all of them had needed. Arcturus ran the house with the administrative precision of a man who had been doing so for 60 years, attended to his correspondence and his investments and the political machinery of wizarding Britain that he operated through influence rather than office. He played chess with Harry 4 evenings a week. He continued Harry's formal education in history, politics, and what he called the practical management of consequence, which was the Black family's term for the discipline of thinking through the full chain of effects before acting. It was something Harry took seriously, because Arcturus made it serious without making it frightening, and because the intellectual architecture of it was genuinely interesting. Regulus was Harry's closest teacher and, in ways that had emerged organically rather than by design, something like an older brother. He taught magic theory and dark arts defense with equal seriousness. Understanding the threat, he maintained, was as important as being able to counter it, and Harry should know both sides of every spell he might face. He was also the person Harry went to when he had a question he didn't want to take to Arcturus, which happened regularly because Harry was 10 and there were certain categories of question that benefited from a less formal listener. Sirius was, in the way of Sirius, a hurricane that had agreed to live inside a house. His recovery was not linear but it was real. He regained weight. He reclaimed, piece by piece, the physical capability that Azkaban had eroded. He transformed into his animagus form, a great black dog, and ran in the private garden every morning until he was tired, which took longer to achieve each week. He was louder than anyone else at Grimmauld Place by a significant margin, more likely to laugh, more likely to argue about small things with absolute conviction, more likely to appear at Harry's bedroom door at 7 in the morning because he'd had an idea and it couldn't wait. He was also, Harry quickly discovered, the best practical magic teacher of any of them. He had a gift for demonstration over explanation, for showing the feel of a spell rather than the mechanics of it, and he taught Harry his first proper defensive casting at age 10 with the brisk enthusiasm of someone who had spent 5 years unable to move and was now extremely enthusiastic about movement. Again, Sirius said, across the training room in the basement that Regulus and Arcturus had cleared out and fitted for practice. This time don't drop your elbow. I don't have a wand, Harry said. I know, Sirius said. I want to see the wandless version. Forget the incantation, what's the intention? Harry thought about it. The protego he'd been working on was a shield, not a barrier between himself and a physical object but a barrier between himself and a spell, and the distinction was about understanding what the spell was made of, which was intent as much as energy, and meeting the intent with your own. He reached for the structure of it, the feeling, and threw it up without a word. Sirius threw a mild stinging hex at him. The hex stopped 18 inches from Harry's face. There it is, Sirius said, with a grin that was increasingly, with every passing month, more fully his own. Hold it, hold, now drop it, let me try something heavier. How heavy? Harry said, keeping the shield in place. Nothing that'll leave a mark. Maybe. Sirius. Kidding. Probably. The hex was considerably stronger than the first one. Harry's shield buckled at the edges, reformed, held. The effort of it showed in his face. It was real work, this, the wandless version that used his own magical core as the medium rather than a wand as the channel, but it held, and when Sirius stopped pushing he was breathing harder than he'd started. That's 3 times better than last week, Sirius said. The control is there. What you need is stamina, you can do it but you can't do it for 20 minutes straight. That's what we work on next. Magic endurance training, Harry said, slightly out of breath. Think of it as going from a sprinter to a distance runner. Sirius handed him a water flask from the side table. Your core's strong, the raw power is there. It's always been there, it's just, bigger than my control, Harry said. Getting there, Sirius said. You're catching up. But for Hogwarts you're going to want a wand for the formal stuff, it's faster, more precise for complex casting. The wandless capability you have is your insurance policy. Harry drank his water and thought about Hogwarts. He'd been thinking about it more frequently lately, less than a year away now, and it occupied a particular space in his mind because it was the first time he would be fully public. Not Harry Potter the boy that people occasionally caught glimpses of in Diagon Alley and then decided they must have been mistaken, but Hadrian Black-Potter, walking into Hogwarts in front of every other 11-year-old in Britain and whatever the faculty's reaction to that was going to be. Are you nervous about it? Sirius asked. Harry looked at him. No. Sirius tilted his head, assessing. You're not lying but you're not telling me the whole truth either. Harry paused. I'm not nervous. I'm paying attention. There's a difference. Sirius considered this. Your grandfather says things like that. I know, Harry said. I've been paying attention to him for 6 years. Sirius grinned. Come on. One more round and then Regulus said something about dinner being at 7 and if we're late he'll eat the good bread. They went again, and Harry held the shield for 11 minutes this time, and when it finally broke he was grinning because 11 minutes was 4 longer than his previous best, and Sirius caught him by the shoulder when he stumbled from the effort and said, quietly and sincerely, James would have, and then stopped. Harry looked up at him. He'd have been very pleased, Sirius said. About all of this. About you. Harry held his gaze for a moment. He had learned, over years, to receive things without deflecting them. Arcturus had taught him that, in his dry undemonstrative way, that accepting something genuine was a form of respect for the person offering it. Good, Harry said. That matters. They went upstairs to dinner, and Regulus had in fact eaten the good bread, but Creature had made more, and it was a loud and slightly chaotic meal in the way that meals at Grimmauld Place had become over the past year, which was nothing like what this house had been for most of its history and which was, Harry thought, Watching Arcturus observe the scene from the head of the table with an expression that was approximately as close to contentment as his face was configured to produce. Exactly right. His Hogwarts letter arrived on the morning of his 11th birthday. He had been expecting it for weeks with the specific quality of attention he gave to anticipated things, ready without being tense, but there was still something about seeing it, the cream envelope with the emerald ink and the Hogwarts seal in red wax, that made it real in a way the anticipation hadn't. Mr. H. Black-Potter, the envelope said. The East Wing Master Bedroom, 12, Grimmauld Place, London. He opened it at the birthday breakfast table while Sirius was loudly maintaining that no one needed to go to Hogwarts at all since everything important could be learned at home and therefore they could all stay here indefinitely, which he was saying for effect rather than meaning and which everyone was ignoring. He read the letter. Then he looked up. Well? Arcturus said, from the head of the table. Hogwarts, Harry said. 1st of September. The table was quiet for a half-second. Then Sirius made a noise of genuine celebration that was slightly too loud for the breakfast room. Regulus allowed himself a rare wide smile, Creature appeared from nowhere with an additional dish of something excellent, and Arcturus Black looked at his great-great-grandchild across the table with an expression that said everything he would never quite say out loud. Harry folded the letter carefully. He thought about everything that came next, Diagon Alley, the wand, the school, Dumbledore, the Philosopher's Stone that Regulus had mentioned 3 weeks ago as an object of concern currently rumored to be under heavy guard at Hogwarts, the prophecy, all of it. He thought about the 10-year-old version of himself who had stood in the training room last year holding a shield for 7 minutes and thought that was impressive. He thought about the version of himself that was sitting here now, 11 years old, who could hold it for 30. He thought about Arcturus, who had walked into a house in Surrey and opened a cupboard door and changed the direction of everything. "Thank you," Harry said. Arcturus looked at him. "For coming to get me," Harry said. "When you didn't have to." The table was very quiet. "I had to," Arcturus said, with a flatness that meant the opposite of what it sounded like. "You are a black. I do not leave my own in cupboards." A pause. "Besides." He picked up his tea. "You would have been wasted." Sirius made a strangled sound that was definitely him not crying about it. Regulus was looking at the ceiling with great concentration. Harry looked at Arcturus and smiled, the full unguarded smile that he had stopped hiding somewhere around age 7, the one that was nothing like the careful watchful expression he'd worn in that cupboard in Surrey, and Arcturus, very briefly, smiled back. Then Arcturus said, "Diagon Alley is Thursday. We will take the full day. Regulus, I want you to come, we will need Gringotts and Ollivanders and I intend to make certain that the boys' public introduction is managed properly." He set down his tea. The wizarding world is going to have to revise several of its assumptions about Harry Potter. "Oh, good," Sirius said, recovering himself, "I love when it has to do that." "The wizarding world," Arcturus said, with the dry precision that was his version of warmth, "is going to find the next few years very educational." He was not wrong. Chapter 3, Diagon Alley. The morning was sharp and bright, the kind of late August day that London occasionally produced as though apologizing for the rest of its weather. Harry stood on the front steps of Grimmauld Place in dark trousers and a green shirt that fit properly. He had strong feelings about clothes that fit, a preference cultivated partly by aesthetics and partly by the memory of wearing Dudley Dursley's cast-offs, and watched Arcturus descend the steps behind him with the particular unhurried authority of a man for whom the world arranged itself rather than the other way around. Sirius came out last, shrugging on his coat, and said, "Right, then. Diagon Alley. Shall we cause a scene or is today a dignity day?" "Every day is a dignity day," Arcturus said, without turning around. "That's not a no," Sirius said to Harry. "It's absolutely a no," Harry said. "He's been spending too much time with grandfather," Sirius told Regulus, who had appeared from around the side of the house where he'd been checking the wards, as was his habit whenever they left. Regulus still moved carefully in public, his glamour in place, the comfortable fiction of his death maintained. He used a different name, Aldrich, which he hated, but which Arcturus had chosen from a shortlist and which had the virtue of sounding nothing like Regulus. "He's been spending exactly the right amount of time with me," Arcturus said. "We're taking the Fleur to the Leaky Cauldron. Stay together in the alley, the Gringotts' visit will attract attention and I want us clear of the main thoroughfare before it spreads." "Will it spread?" Harry asked. Arcturus looked at him. "Harry Potter has not been seen publicly in 10 years. "Yes. It will spread." They went through the flue in sequence. Harry stepped out of the Leaky Cauldron's fireplace into the dim smoky warmth of the pub and brushed ash off his sleeve, and the first thing he noticed was that several people glanced his way with the mild curiosity of those sharing a space, and then looked away, and then looked back. He understood, academically, that his face was James Potter's face. He understood, in somewhat more complicated terms, that his name, both of his names, carried weight in this world that had nothing to do with him personally and everything to do with things that had happened before he was old enough to understand them. He had prepared for this. He was prepared. What he hadn't fully prepared for was how quickly a look of mild curiosity became a look of recognition, and how recognition spread through a room. It moved like ripple in still water, one person, then the person next to them turning to follow their gaze, then another, and by the time Arcturus and Regulus had stepped out of the fireplace behind him the Leaky Cauldron had gone from its usual murmuring business to something quieter and more watchful. An elderly witch 2 tables over had both hands pressed to her mouth. A man at the bar was whispering to the barman, who was leaning forward with his eyes very wide. Harry stood in the middle of it with his hands in his pockets and felt, rather than the uncomfortable exposure he'd anticipated, something closer to assessment. He was looking at them just as they were looking at him, and this, he thought, Arcturus's voice in his head, the right to occupy a room, was precisely the distinction between being watched and being seen. Tom the barman appeared from around the bar wringing his hands in the manner of a man who was simultaneously thrilled and terrified. "Mr. Potter, Mr. Black, sir, welcome, can I get you anything?" "We have, thank you, Tom," Arcturus said, in the tone he used when courtesy was necessary and brevity was preferred. "We're just passing through." He led them through the back of the Leaky Cauldron without pausing, tapped the appropriate brick in the back wall. Harry watched the pattern, as he always watched things, and the archway opened onto Diagon Alley. It hit Harry all at once, as it always did when they came here, which was not often enough. The sound of it first, voices and the percussion of commerce, owls and the ring of a shop bell, 2 people arguing pleasantly about broom polish 3 stalls down. Then the smell, old wood and fresh bread and something metallic and magical that had no Muggle equivalent. Then the visual sweep of it, the cobbled street running away in both directions lined with shop fronts in every shade of improbable, the robes and cloaks and the occasional pointed hat worn with absolute unself-consciousness. He had loved it since the first time Arcturus had brought him here at 7 for new books, when it had felt like a world confirming what he'd suspected, that the thing in him, the warm bright thing, was not strange here, was not something to be minimized, was simply the way people were. He loved it now with more complexity, with the layered understanding of someone who knew the political architecture beneath the cobblestones, who understood what Gringotts represented and what the ministry's presence 2 streets over meant and which of the shop fronts were fronts for things that weren't entirely shops. He loved it the way he was learning to love most things, fully, without sentimentality, with his eyes open. "Eyes forward," Arcturus said quietly beside him. "We're moving." People were staring. Not everyone, most of the alley was going about its business with the general self-absorption of a busy marketplace, but enough. Harry heard his name spoken in a low voice twice before they'd gone 20 feet, and felt the ripple of recognition moving ahead of them through the crowd. He did not look at anyone in particular. He walked. Gringotts rose at the end of the alley like a deliberate affront to everything around it, brilliant white marble columns and burnished bronze doors and the general architectural message that this building had nothing to prove and was not attempting to charm anyone. 2 goblin guards flanked the entrance, still as statuary, their expressions carrying the particular brand of contempt that Gringotts' staff had refined over centuries of dealing with humans who understood neither their money nor their obligations. Arcturus walked through the doors without pausing, and the guard nearest the door inclined his head fractionally, which Harry had learned enough to understand was the goblin equivalent of rolling out a red carpet. "Director Sharpax is expecting us," Arcturus told the goblin at the nearest desk, who looked up with sharp amber eyes. "Mr. Black." The goblin's gaze moved to Harry with an assessment that was purely professional and entirely unsentimental. "Mr. Black-Potter. The director requests that you use the private conference suite. The main hall is anticipated to become somewhat crowded in the next quarter hour." "Then we should move quickly," Arcturus said. They were escorted through Gringotts by a different route than the standard one, narrower corridors, older stone, past vaults that were significantly deeper than the ones accessible by the standard cart route. Harry noted everything: the depth of the magic in the walls, which was older than anything in Grimmauld Place and had a different texture, more bone-dry and absolute, the way the torches burned in colors that were not quite fire, the sounds of the deeper vault levels that were not quite sounds. Director Sharpax was a goblin of advanced years, which meant nothing in terms of diminishment. Older goblins were not diminished, they were simply more permanently themselves, their features carved sharper by time. He stood behind a desk of dark stone and regarded Harry with the settled interest of someone who has been waiting for this meeting for a while. "Mr. Black-Potter," he said. "You are considerably more coherent than I expected." Harry sat down in the offered chair. "What did you expect? Your estate has been awaiting active management since 1981. In my experience, heirs who come to their accounts at 11 without proper preparation are distressed by what they find." "I've been preparing since I was 9, Harry said. "What have you found?" Sharpax almost, smiled, in the particular goblin way that was more like a controlled baring of teeth. He opened a ledger the size of a moderate dictionary. The Black family accounts were in excellent order, because Arcturus had been managing them actively for 60 years and had not allowed anything to slide. The Potter accounts were a different matter. They were intact, nothing had been stolen, which had been one of Arcturus's earlier suspicions, now apparently incorrect, but they had been sitting in a state of suspended management, the investment static, the property matters unattended, generating interest in the basic sense while everything else that should have been happening had not. The Potter vaults hold liquid assets, property titles in several locations, family heirlooms, and the accumulated documents of 8 generations, Sharpax said. Since your majority will not be legal for some years, active management authority technically requires either your own presence combined with a sworn family overseer, or your head of house acting on your behalf. In this case, Mr. Black has been filing quarterly oversight reports and we have been holding the accounts in a state of conservative maintenance. I'd like to see the property titles, Harry said. And the heirloom inventory. Sharpax turned 3 pages. The Potter property holdings include the primary residence at Godric's Hollow, currently sealed, the Potter summer property in Pembrokeshire, and a townhouse in Edinburgh, also sealed. All 3 have been maintained by Gringotts Property Management at standard rates. He looked up. Godric's Hollow has remained structurally intact. Wizards have been known to visit, it has become something of a pilgrimage site. Harry considered this. I'd like it unsealed. Properly unsealed, full wards, family access only. Not a pilgrimage site. That can be arranged. What about the heirlooms? The inventory was long and interesting. Harry went through it with the focus of someone building a picture rather than compiling a list, noting the items he recognized from the books Regulus had given him on Potter family history, the cloak, which he had known about, listed with the flatness of a Gringotts inventory that communicated neither its uniqueness nor its significance. A family grimoire going back to the medieval period. Several items of uncertain provenance that Sharpax described as requiring specialist assessment, magical properties indeterminate, which Harry filed away as things that Regulus would want to look at. The Cloak of Invisibility, Harry said. It's listed as being held separately from the main heirloom vault. Sharpax was very still for a moment. It is held in the secondary vault, yes. Why separately? There was a request, Sharpax said, from Albus Dumbledore, filed in 1981, to hold it in a condition of accessible storage rather than sealed heirloom status. The room was very quiet. Harry looked at Arcturus. Arcturus looked at Harry, his expression giving away precisely nothing. By what authority did Dumbledore make that request? Harry asked. He represented himself as a family friend and named himself executor of James Potter's verbal estate wishes, Sharpak said, with the tone of a goblin who was aware that this answer was interesting and was interested in what the response would be. He was not named executor in any formal document. No formal document exists. Then the request was made without legal standing and the cloak should be in the sealed heirloom vault, Harry said. Please move it there. It is a Potter family heirloom and I am the heir of the Potter family. Sharpak wrote something in the ledger. As you instruct. Sirius, from his chair slightly behind Harry's, made a sound of quiet appreciation that he covered with a cough. Regulus, who was by the window, did nothing, but there was something in the set of his shoulders. Arcturus said, we would also like to review the status of the Black family's secondary holdings in the Eastern properties. I believe we discussed a potential consolidation in February. The meeting ran for another 40 minutes, which Harry spent listening and contributing when he had something specific to say, which was more often than Sharpak had apparently expected. By the end the Potter accounts had been restructured, the property titles had been transferred to active status, and 2 investment portfolios that had been sitting dormant for 10 years had been reactivated with new directives. As they were leaving, Sharpak said, and it was clearly not a routine statement, it had the quality of something chosen, the House of Black's accounts have always been impeccably maintained, Mr. Black. It is gratifying to see the House of Potter's accounts managed with equal seriousness. It won't happen again, Harry said. He was not talking about the accounts. Sharpak looked at him for a moment. Then he inclined his head, which Harry had learned was a different gesture from the one at the door, this one was something closer to respect between peers. They emerged from Gringotts into the alley. Which had changed. Not dramatically, the world had not stopped, but there was a different quality to the crowd now, a kind of casual but not casual that Harry recognized as people who had arranged themselves to have reasons to be near a particular location. Twice as many people in the vicinity of the bank steps as there had been before. More faces turned in their direction than could be accounted for by coincidence. Word had spread. He had known it would. It had spread the way news about Harry Potter always seemed to spread in the wizarding world, faster than was entirely natural, with an emotional charge that transformed simple information into something more volatile. Harry descended the Gringotts steps with Arcturus on his left and Sirius on his right and Regulus 3 steps behind, and he walked into the alley properly for the first time as the public version of himself, and the thing that happened as he did it was, nothing dramatic. No pause, no acknowledgement, no performance of any kind. He simply walked the way he always walked, at his own pace, his eyes open, taking in everything. The first person who approached was a woman in her 30s with a copy of the Daily Prophet tucked under her arm and an expression of pure undisguised emotion. She stopped in front of them and looked at Harry and said, "You're him," in the tone of someone confirming a miracle. "Harry Black-Potter," Harry said. "Yes." The woman pressed her hand to her mouth, much like the witch in the leaky cauldron had. We lost our son in the war. He was fighting with the Order. They said you'd come back, I'm sorry about your son," Harry said, and he meant it entirely. He had learned, from Arcturus, that condolences said cheaply were worse than none, and from Regulus, that the weight of other people's grief was something you were not required to perform around but were required to acknowledge. What was his name? The woman blinked, clearly not expecting the question. Emmerich. Emmerich Fairfax. He should be remembered, Harry said. I'm sorry he isn't here. She looked at him, at this 11-year-old boy saying something true and direct and without false comfort, and what moved across her face was something more than the reflexive hope that had been there before. It was a reassessment. Arcturus placed a brief hand on Harry's shoulder. They moved on. 2 more people stopped them in the next 100 feet. Harry handled each encounter the same way, direct, warm without being performative, brief without being dismissive. He was not, he had decided, going to be the symbol that the woman at the bank steps had looked at him with. He was also not going to be cold about it. He was just going to be himself, which was, in his experience, the most complicated option and also the only one worth doing. Sirius was walking slightly behind his right shoulder, and Harry heard him say quietly to Regulus, "He's better at this than James was." "James had a different style," Regulus said. "James would have been grinning and shaking hands and causing a scene," Sirius said, with the warmth of someone reporting a flaw they loved. "Harry's doing," a pause, "something else. He's being Arcturus," Regulus said. With better warmth. "Is that a compliment to Arcturus? Don't tell him I said it." They reached Madame Malkin's, where Harry needed robes. The fittings were a production not because of him but because of the shop itself, which was busier than usual in the manner of shops that had received early warning that something interesting was coming, and Madame Malkin herself, who was a small efficient woman of 60 with excellent taste and a professional inability to be impressed by anyone, which Harry respected immediately. He was standing on the fitting podium with 2 robe lengths in progress when the shop door opened. The man who entered was blond and elegant and carried himself with the particular quality of someone who had never been required to consider whether they were welcome in any room. He was followed by a boy about Harry's age, same coloring, same bone structure, a younger and less finished version of the man, and a pale, fine-featured woman who wore her composure like armor. Lucius Malfoy. Harry had read about Lucius Malfoy. He had a file, Regulus had built it, because Regulus had known him personally and had the particular knowledge of someone who had watched a man choose the comfortable version of loyalty over the principled one. Death Eater, acquitted through the convenient combination of bribery and the claim of imperious curse. Patriarch of a house that was technically allied with the Blacks through the Narcissa marriage, which made Draco Malfoy Harry's relation by the loosest possible definition of the term. A man who had, by Regulus's account, sent his own wife and child home while he continued serving Voldemort until it became strategically disadvantageous to do so. Lucius Malfoy looked across the shop and saw Arcturus Black, and the expression that moved across his face was a complicated diplomatic navigation of surprise, recognition, and the social calculation of a man who had spent 30 years surviving by knowing exactly which way to face. Then his gaze moved to Harry. "Arcturus," Malfoy said, his voice smooth and pleasantly pitched, "I had heard you were in the alley today." "And this must be Hadrian Black-Potter," Arcturus said. "My heir." Harry watched Lucius process this. The word heir, stated that flatly by Arcturus Black, carried weight that Harry understood precisely. It was not just familial acknowledgement, it was a formal declaration of position, and it meant that anything Lucius Malfoy directed at Harry he was directing at the House of Black, with all the historical and political implications thereof. Lucius descended on Harry with the warmth of a man who had decided very quickly that the situation required warmth. "Hadrian." His handshake was firm, practiced. "It's a pleasure. I am Lucius Malfoy. Your family and mine have long been allied," Harry said. "Through your wife's line, which is Black." "I'm aware." He looked at Lucius with the calm attention he gave to everything. "I've read the family history thoroughly." Something shifted in Lucius's eyes, not discomfort exactly, but a recalibration. He had expected, Harry thought, a version of himself that had not yet been educated. "Of course. Your grandfather has been thorough in your preparation." "My whole family has been thorough," Harry said. He glanced at the boy behind Lucius. "Draco." The boy, Draco Malfoy, 10 years old and already wearing his family name like a title rather than an identity, looked at Harry with grey eyes that were doing their own recalibrating. He had been prepared for a certain kind of encounter, Harry could see that, had been coached, probably, in exactly the kind of approach that would position the Malfoy family favorably with the heir of House Black. He had not been prepared for the heir of House Black to already know his name and to use it with the flat familiarity of someone who had already decided where he stood. "You know who I am," Draco said. It came out as something between a statement and a question. "I make a point of knowing things," Harry said. He held Draco's gaze for a moment, not hostile, not warm, simply direct in the way that made people feel seen rather than assessed, which was a distinction Regulus had taught him mattered. You're on Madame Malkin's list for robes too. Hogwarts? Yes, Draco said. He was recalibrating too, but faster than his father, and with more visible curiosity. You. 1st of September, Harry said. Same. A pause. The coaching had apparently not covered what to do with an unexpected peer, and underneath the performed poise Draco Malfoy was, Harry noted, simply a boy of 10 who was curious and slightly thrown. What house do you think you'll be in? I don't think about it much, Harry said. The hat sorts. I'll end up where I end up. Draco looked faintly scandalized, in the way of someone for whom house affiliation was a predetermined matter. My family has been Slytherin for many generations, Harry said. I know the history. He looked at Draco steadily. I also know that where you're sorted and what you do about it are two different questions, and the second one is more interesting. Draco opened his mouth. Then closed it. Then said, slowly, that's an unusual thing to say. I say unusual things sometimes, Harry said. I find it tends to sort out who's worth talking to. There was a pause. Lucius, who had been monitoring this exchange with the expression of a chess player watching an unexpected move develop on the board, said smoothly, I hope we'll have an opportunity to speak more, Hadrian. Perhaps, Arcturus said, cutting him off with the seamless precision of a man who had been cutting Lucius Malfoy off since before Lucius was born, when we have finished Harry's fittings. It was a dismissal that was absolutely polite and absolutely final. Lucius received it with the grace of a man who had no better option and moved toward the opposite end of the shop with Narcissa, whose eyes had found Harry once and looked at him with something that was more complicated than the social maneuvering of her husband, something that had the color of family recognition in it, of grief, of the face of people she'd lost that Harry apparently wore. Draco was steered away by a gentle hand from his mother, but he looked back at Harry twice. Not with hostility. With something more like puzzlement, the expression of a boy who had had an interaction go differently than he expected and wasn't sure whether that was good or bad. Harry stepped back up onto the fitting podium. Madame Malkin returned to her work. Well, Sirius said, very quietly, from the chair where he had been entirely silent throughout, that went nothing like Lucius planned. Was it meant to go a particular way? Harry asked. He was going to offer you Draco as an ally, a formal alliance between the houses, probably. He'd be the one who brought the Potter heir back into the pureblood fold, which would have been a significant political asset. Sirius's voice was entirely conversational. You neither accepted nor rejected it. You just talked to Draco like a person. He is a person, Harry said. You'd be surprised how many people forget that about Malfoys. Sirius leaned back in his chair. Draco didn't hate it. No, Harry said. He didn't. He filed that away. Draco Malfoy was not his father, or not yet, or not necessarily. He was a boy who had been prepared to play a role in a game that had been designed before he was old enough to agree to play it, which was, Harry thought, a kind of prison, and Harry had strong feelings about prisons. He was not sure yet what he intended to do about Draco Malfoy. But he was interested. Ollivander's was the last stop, and it was its own kind of experience. The shop was narrow and dim and smelled of sawdust and something older and stranger, and the shelves went back far enough that the rear of the shop existed in a different quality of shadow than the front. Harry stepped inside and felt the magic of the place like a pressure change, all those wands, all that stored intention, all that dormant will. Ollivander himself appeared from between the shelves in the way of a man who had mastered the art of the dramatic entrance through sheer repetition. He was ancient in the way of people who have dedicated so long to a specific thing that the specific thing has become physically visible in them. His eyes were pale and very bright and they fixed on Harry with an intensity that was entirely professional and slightly unsettling. Harry Potter, Ollivander said. Or Hadrian Black-Potter, as I understand it now. But to me you will always be the question I have been waiting to answer. He paused. Your parents, both of them, were customers of mine. Your father, 10 inches, mahogany, pliable, excellent for transfiguration. Your mother, Willow, 10¼ inches, swishy, very good for charms work. He tilted his head. I have been thinking about you for 10 years, Mr. Black-Potter, and what wand it would take. What conclusion did you reach? Harry asked. None, Ollivander said, with evident pleasure. Which means this will be interesting. It was interesting. The first 9 wands did nothing, not the standard faint trembling of a near miss or the scattered sparks of a partial match, but genuine nothing, which Ollivander noted with escalating engagement. He disappeared into the shelves 3 times, returning with combinations that were increasingly unusual: holly, ash, blackthorn, cores of unicorn hair, phoenix feather, dragon heartstring in several lengths. Harry picked up each one and felt for the warmth he associated with his own magic, the warm bright thing, and each time it was either absent or wrong in some specific way he couldn't articulate. Interesting, Ollivander said, after the 12th wand. You are unusually self-possessed for an 11-year-old. Most children by this point are either bored or agitated. You are neither. I'm paying attention, Harry said. To what? To the wands. Each one is slightly different. I'm trying to understand what's missing. Ollivander looked at him with those pale bright eyes. And what is missing? Harry considered. It's hard to explain. It's like, I know what my magic feels like. I've been doing wandless work since I was 5. Whatever this thing is supposed to do, it needs to extend that. Not replace it. They all feel like they're trying to channel something rather than work with it. Ollivander was very still for a moment. Then he said, wait here. He disappeared into the back of the shop for what felt like a long time. Harry stood at the counter. Arcturus, who had been standing by the door with the stillness of a man who was content to wait, met his eye once. The expression was readable to Harry by now: pay attention, this matters. Ollivander returned holding a box that was slightly different from the others, older, the wood darker, handled more carefully. He set it on the counter and opened it with the deliberateness of someone presenting something significant. The wand inside was 11 inches, slender, made from a wood that was almost black walnut, Harry identified from his reading, a rare wand wood associated with powerful magical cores and self-knowledge. Black walnut and phoenix feather, Ollivander said. 11 inches, unyielding. The phoenix that provided this feather provided only one other, and I have a feeling, Mr. Black-Potter, that you know where that wand is. Harry picked it up. The warmth was immediate and enormous, not the cautious flicker he'd felt with some of the others but a full recognition, his own magic rising to meet the wand, the way the book had come off the shelf when he was 5, the way Creature's tea had cooled, the way the hex had stopped in the air, all of it, the accumulated 7 years of his own magic finding its extension. Every wand on the shelves trembled. The candles throughout the shop flared. Several boxes fell from the lower shelves in a sequence like a ripple moving outward from his hand. Harry did not jump. He stood with the wand in his hand and let the power settle, directed it the way Regulus had taught him to direct his core, inward, structured, contained without being suppressed. The candles returned to their normal height. The shelves stopped trembling. Ollivander was watching him with an expression that was, for the first time in the encounter, undisguised awe, not the performed quality of his entrance but the real kind, the kind that happened when someone witnessed something they'd spent a lifetime thinking about and found that the reality exceeded the theory. Curious, Ollivander said, very quietly. Curious indeed. I'll take it, Harry said. I suspect it was never going to let you leave without it, Ollivander said. He was looking at Harry with those bright pale eyes. Your wand chose you as readily as any wand I have ever seen in 70 years of practice. And the core, he paused. The brother wand, Harry said. Yes. Ollivander wrapped the box carefully. I wonder, and I mean this as a serious question, not a dramatic one, whether you understand what that connection means in practice. It means, Harry said, that there is a fundamental magical link between me and Voldemort. And that in a direct wand confrontation, neither wand will act against its brother. He took the wrapped box. I don't intend to rely on my wand in a direct confrontation with Voldemort. I have other options. Ollivander stared at him. How much for the wand? Harry asked. Ollivander named the price, which Harry paid from the coin purse Arcturus had given him this morning with the flat instruction spend what is necessary and nothing to perform, and they walked back out into Diagon Alley where the afternoon had tilted toward gold. Other options? Sirius said, falling into step. I've been doing wandless work for 6 years, Harry said. A wand is a tool. I know how to work without one. If it comes to a direct confrontation, I'm not going to wave my wand at him and hope for the best. Sirius processed this for a moment. That is either the most sensible thing I've ever heard about fighting Voldemort or the most terrifying. Probably both, Regulus said, from Harry's other side. Good, Harry said. That's probably the right reaction. They stopped at Flourish and Blot's last because Harry wanted books that weren't on the Hogwarts list and because Arcturus never passed a bookshop without going in, which was one of the traits Harry felt most closely aligned with him on. He was in the history section, looking at a volume on the International Statute of Secrecy that Regulus had mentioned as historically reductive and worth arguing with, when he became aware that he was being watched. Not the ambient watching of the alley, but specifically, carefully, from behind a shelf 2 rows over. He turned without pretense and looked directly at the watcher. A girl with very large hair and an armful of books looked back at him without the startlement of someone caught staring but with the frank curiosity of someone who has decided that being caught staring is less interesting than simply continuing to stare. She was about his age, dressed neatly, with brown eyes behind which an enormous amount of thinking was clearly going on at all times. You're Harry Potter, she said. Harry Black-Potter, he said. Yes. I've read about you, she said. Most people have, he said. Not all of them accurately. She tilted her head slightly. The Daily Prophet's account of your childhood says you grew up with Muggle relatives in Surrey. I did, Harry said. For 4 years. Then my grandfather took me home. And you've been educated privately since then? She was not being intrusive. The questions had the quality of someone clarifying information for a framework they were building, the way Harry himself asked questions. Yes, he said. And you're going to Hogwarts this September. How do you know that? You have the same school list I have, Harry said, nodding at the paper in her hand. You're getting the standard texts plus 5 others, which means you're either very interested in the subjects or planning ahead for second year, or both. He looked at her assessment. Both, I think. She looked at him with an expression that was doing something new, still curious, but added to with something that might have been the beginnings of respect. Both, she confirmed. I'm Hermione Granger. Harry Black-Potter, he said again, formally, because that was the appropriate response to a proper introduction. Which house are you hoping for? Gryffindor, she said, without hesitation. You. I don't have a preference, he said. I'll do well wherever I am. She looked at him the way he'd looked at the wand, assessing, thorough, arriving at a conclusion. That's a very confident thing to say. Is it inaccurate? A pause. Then, and he appreciated this, she did not offer easy agreement, I don't know you well enough to know. But it doesn't sound like arrogance. It sounds like a conclusion you arrived at. It is, he said. Most people who say things like that are performing confidence, she said. You're not performing. No, he said. I'm not. They looked at each other for a moment in the slightly strange atmosphere of 2 people who have just met and have already established, without either of them intending to, that they are the kind of people who say what they mean. What's that book? She asked, nodding at the volume in his hand. Critiqued History of the International Statute of Secrecy, Harry said. My uncle says it's reductive. I want to know where he's wrong and where he's right. Your uncle, she said, with the particular precision of someone who had read enough about the Black family to know the complications involved. Regulus, Harry said, with an easy matter-of-factness. He knows a lot about political history. She processed this, he could see her processing it, the way the information slotted into context she already had, and importantly, the way she did not make a social performance of the weight of it. She simply noted it and moved on. He appreciated that very much. "I've been reading about wizarding political history," she said. "It's more complex than the standard texts make it look." "They always are," Harry said. "Which standard text?" "Hogwarts, a history." "Good starting point," Harry said. "Biased toward institutional self-interest but well-sourced." "What did you find complex about it?" She told him. Specifically, with references, with the genuine enthusiasm of someone talking about something they'd actually thought hard about. Harry asked 2 questions and she answered both and asked him one back and he answered it, and they were 10 minutes into what was becoming a real conversation when Sirius appeared at the end of the aisle looking for him. Sirius took in the scene, Harry and a girl with an enormous amount of hair talking with the focused intensity of 2 people who had forgotten they were in a shop, and his expression was of a man who was finding this deeply entertaining and was being very good about not saying so. "We're heading out in 10 minutes, Sirius said. "Your grandfather is at the counter." "Right," Harry said. He turned to Hermione. "It was good to meet you." "You too," she said, with the directness of someone who had decided something. "I hope we're in the same house." Harry thought about what Sirius had said in Madame Malkin's, sorting out who's worth talking to. "I find I agree with that," he said. "Good luck with the additional reading." She held up the 5 extra books and almost smiled. "Same to you." He went to find Arcturus, who was at the front counter with a stack of books that Harry was fairly sure were all for him rather than any ostensible adult purpose. Arcturus did not look up as Harry arrived beside him. "Who was the girl?" Arcturus asked. "Hermione Granger," Harry said. "Muggle-born. She's read everything and she's going to Hogwarts." "Impressions?" Harry thought about it, the questions she'd asked, the way she'd listened, the absence of performance in either direction. "She's the most interesting person I've met who isn't related to me." Arcturus put a book on the stack. "Make sure you're in the same house." "I can't control the sorting hat." "You can control the conversation you have with it." Arcturus finally looked at him. "Which you will think carefully about." The hat is legilimentary, not actively, but it reads the broad shape of a person's mind. Know what you want before you put it on. Harry filed this with everything else. The hat read minds. He had a clemency shields of unusual strength for an 11-year-old. The conversation with the hat was going to be interesting. "Ready?" Sirius said, appearing at his other elbow. "Almost," Harry said. He looked back, once, at the history section where Hermione Granger had gone back to her books, and then he looked forward at the door and the alley beyond it, gold now in the late afternoon, busy and magical and complicated and his. "Ready," he said. They walked back through Diagon Alley in the early evening, and the watching had changed quality, less the startlement of the morning and more the settling of something established, the way news changes from shock to fact. People looked, and Harry let them look, and what he saw in most of their faces was something that he hadn't entirely anticipated: relief. Simple, uncomplicated relief, the expression of people who had been waiting a long time for something and were now, at last, convinced that the thing they'd been waiting for was real. He understood, walking through it, that he was not just Harry Black-Potter to these people. He was a decade of hope made into a person. He was the answer to a war that had cost them things they hadn't gotten back. He was a proof. He did not find it comfortable, exactly. But he found it comprehensible, which was a start. "Grandfather," he said, as they approached the leaky cauldron. Arcturus said. "They're going to do that at Hogwarts." "The looking. The expecting." "Yes," Arcturus said. "And Dumbledore is going to try to shape it. What they expect. He has been doing so for 10 years. He will continue." A pause. "And you will give them something to look at that has nothing to do with Dumbledore's plan." which will, over time, be more interesting to them than the plan ever was. Harry thought about this as they stepped through the pub door, back into the smoky warmth, back through the fireplace one by one. He thought about the woman at the Gringotts steps. About Draco Malfoy's recalibrating grey eyes. About Hermione Granger saying you're not performing. He thought about what Arcturus had said the night he'd read the dossier for the first time, you are not the boy they were planning for, and about what that meant in practice, which was this, he could not control what people expected of him. He could only keep being himself, completely, without performance or apology, and let the expectation adjust to the reality. It would. He was patient. He stepped through the fireplace and into Grimmauld Place, and the portraits in the hallway watched him come home with the quiet approval of the permanently historical, and Creature was at the foot of the stairs with the expression he wore when dinner was ready and he was pleased about it, and the house smelled of good food and old wood and the particular smell of a place that is, without fanfare or announcement, exactly where you belong. "Good day?" Regulus asked, from the landing above. Harry looked up at him. "We have a wand," he said. "We have the cloak. We have Gringotts sorted." A pause. "And I met Hermione Granger." Regulus came down 2 steps. "And? She's going to be important," Harry said simply. "I don't know how yet. But she is." Regulus looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone hearing an echo of a conversation they'd had with Arcturus years ago. Then he said, "Dinner's in 20 minutes. Wash your hands." Harry went upstairs, and the house settled around him, old and strong and full, for the first time in a very long time, of exactly the right people. Chapter 4, The Sorting of Storms. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at 11 o'clock on the 1st of September, and Harry was on the platform at 10:15 because Arcturus believed that punctuality was the most basic form of respect for your own time and everyone else's. The platform was already busy when they arrived, families clustered around trunks, owls complaining in their cages, the particular energy of a crowd that was excited and trying to manage it. Harry stood with his trolley and his trunk and Hedwig in her cage, a snowy owl that Sirius had appeared with 3 weeks ago with the expression of a man who had thought carefully about a gift and was pretending he hadn't, and watched the platform the way he watched everything, taking its measure. Sirius had come to see him off. Regulus had not, which was practical, too many people who remembered the name Regulus Black, too much risk of the fiction unraveling, but he'd stood at the front door of Grimmauld Place that morning and said, "Pay attention in defense against the dark arts. The theory they teach is correct but incomplete. We'll talk at Christmas." Then he'd gone back inside, which was Regulus's version of an emotional farewell, and Harry received it as such. Arcturus was beside him on the platform, straight-backed and still in the way of a man who was not there to perform fatherly sentiment but had come because it was the appropriate thing to do and because he had found, over the past 7 years, that appropriate things and things he actually wanted to do had developed a troubling tendency to align. "Remember," Arcturus said, without preamble, "that Hogwarts is an institution. Institutions have interests. The people who run institutions serve those interests, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. Professor Dumbledore is the headmaster and he is also the man who left you in a cupboard. These 2 facts about him are equally true and should be held simultaneously." "I know," Harry said. "You will also find that several of your professors will have preconceptions about you. Some will expect too much. Some will expect exactly the wrong things. Some will be testing you for purposes that are not immediately obvious." "I know that too," Harry said. Arcturus looked at him. "I'm aware you know," he said. "I am saying it because saying things matters. Because you are going somewhere I cannot follow and I want the last thing I tell you this morning to be something true." Harry looked up at him, Arcturus, who was 81 years old and had outlived everyone he'd started with and who had walked into a house in Surrey and opened a cupboard door and changed the direction of history, his history, both of theirs. Who had sat in a chair by the window until Harry stopped being afraid to make sounds. Who had played chess with him 4 evenings a week for 6 years and had never, not once, let him win deliberately. "I know," Harry said, for the 3rd time, and this time it meant something else entirely. Arcturus held his gaze for a moment. Then he put one hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, the same gesture he'd used in Diagon Alley, brief and specific in carrying everything it didn't say, and stepped back. "Right," Arcturus said. "Every week," Harry said. "Every week," Arcturus confirmed. Sirius, who had been standing to the side doing an impression of a man who was absolutely not affected by any of this, said, "Right," in a voice that had gone slightly rough, and pulled Harry into a hug that was not brief at all and was extremely genuine, and which Harry returned completely, because Sirius was the kind of person you hugged properly and they both knew it. "Don't let anyone give you grief," Sirius said into the top of his head. "And if they do, I'm aware of my options," Harry said. "That's my boy," Sirius said. Harry picked up Hedwig's cage and got on the train. He found a compartment near the front and settled Hedwig's cage on the rack above and sat by the window and watched the platform clear as the clock ticked toward 11. He was not looking for anyone specific. He was simply looking, as he usually was, and trying to understand the shape of the thing he was walking into. He was sitting there when the compartment door opened and Hermione Granger looked in, with her enormous hair and 3 books already out of her bag and the expression of someone who has been looking for something specific. "I hoped I'd find you before we left," she said. "Do you mind?" "Sit down," Harry said. She sat across from him and put 2 of her 3 books away and opened the third, and they were quiet for a comfortable moment while the train began to move. The platform slid past the window. He caught a last glimpse of Sirius waving with both arms like someone signaling an aircraft, which he managed not to smile at, almost, and then it was gone and there was just the grey-green blur of London giving way to countryside. "Have you looked at the Defense Against the Dark Arts text?" Hermione asked. "Finished it in July," Harry said. "What did you think?" "Competent foundation. The chapter on counter curses is theoretically sound but doesn't address the difference between blocking and deflecting, which matters practically." He paused. "The author seems to assume that defensive magic is primarily reactive. I disagree with that premise." Hermione looked up from her book. "You think defensive magic should be proactive?" "I think the distinction between offense and defense is less meaningful than most people treat it," Harry said. "Understanding what an attack is made of is more useful than waiting for one to happen." She considered this with the focused seriousness he'd noticed in Flourish and Blots, not performing agreement, actually thinking about it. "That's an unusual position for someone who hasn't started formal magical education." "I've had 7 years of informal magical education," Harry said. "Which is different from unusual." She looked at him, the same assessing look from the bookshop. "You're not going to be what people expect, are you?" "People expect a lot of different things," Harry said. "Most of them won't be right regardless of what I do. So I've decided to just be accurate." "Accurate," she repeated, as though testing the word. "What I actually am. Rather than what's convenient for other people's narratives." She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the directness that he was already finding was simply who she was, "Is that going to cause problems?" "Almost certainly," Harry said. "I find I'm not concerned about it." She looked at him once more with that evaluating expression, and then she did the thing he'd noticed in Diagon Alley, settled something, arrived at a conclusion. "Good," she said. "Neither am I." She opened her book again. "Wake me if anything interesting happens outside." "You're going to read the whole way there?" "I'm going to read until something more interesting than this book happens," she said. "Which will depend on the book and the something." Harry looked out the window. The countryside was opening up now, green and unremarkable and traveling past at speed. "Fair enough," he said. They were quiet together for a while, which was the most comfortable kind of quiet, not the silence of people who don't know what to say but the silence of people who don't need to say anything, which was rare enough at 11 to be worth noticing. The compartment door opened again around noon, and Draco Malfoy appeared in it. He was flanked by 2 larger boys, Crabbe and Goyle, Harry identified without effort, both of them wearing the slightly bovine expressions of people who were present primarily for purposes of size, and he had his Diagon Alley composure reinstalled, the slightly elevated chin, the performed ease. But his eyes found Harry immediately, and in them was the same curiosity from Madame Malkin's that the composure was doing a mediocre job of concealing. "Black-Potter," Draco said. "Malfoy," Harry said. "Do you want to sit down or are you standing in doorways generally today?" A flicker of something in Draco's eyes, not quite a smile, but the thought of one. "My compartment's further back. I was looking for," he paused. "I came to find you specifically." "Then sit down," Harry said. "Your associates can find somewhere else or stand in the corridor, it makes no difference to me." Crabbe and Goyle exchanged a look. Draco made a slight gesture and they retreated, with the trained compliance of people who had decided some time ago that thinking was optional when Draco was available. Draco came in and sat down across from Harry, next to Hermione, whom he registered with a careful look that had the quality of a social assessment. "Granger," Hermione said, without looking up from her book. "In case you were going to ask." "I wasn't," Draco said, with the automatic reflex of a boy who had been told certain things about certain people and was not yet far enough from those things to question them on instinct. But he stopped there rather than continuing, which Harry noted. "What did you want to say?" Harry asked. Draco looked at him. The composure adjusted, slightly less performed, slightly more genuine. "My father talked about meeting you for the rest of the day in the alley," he said. "He didn't say what about, exactly, but I could tell he was," a pause, "recalculating something." "Your father recalculates frequently," Harry said. "You know about him," Draco said. "Not accusatory, just noting it." "I told you in Madame Malkin's that I make a point of knowing things." "You knew about me too," Draco said. "Before we met." "What do you know?" Harry looked at him steadily. This was the question beneath the question. Draco Malfoy, who had been prepared for a particular kind of meeting with Harry Potter, who had not gotten that meeting, who was now asking a real question instead of a strategic one. Harry appreciated the shift. "I know your family history," Harry said. "I know your father's political positions and his activities during the last war. I know your mother is a Black, which makes you my family by extension, and I have a personal investment in my family. I know that you've been prepared to play a particular role in a particular game that was designed before you were old enough to agree to it." He paused. "I know that the game and the role and the person are three different things, and that the last one is the only one that matters." Draco was very still. "I don't know you yet," Harry said. "That's what I came to Hogwarts to find out." The compartment was quiet for a moment. Hermione had stopped reading, her book held open at the same page. "And if you find out I'm not worth knowing?" Draco asked, with a precision that suggested the question cost something. "Then I'll know that," Harry said. "And we'll both be better off for the accuracy." He held Draco's gaze. "But I don't make assumptions about people before I have evidence. I was raised not to." Draco looked at him for a long moment, this boy who was not what he'd been prepared for, this member of the House of Black who was simultaneously more formidable and more direct than anything Draco's father had described, and something shifted in him. Not a transformation. A loosening, fractional, like the first movement of a thaw. "My father would say you're wasting time being egalitarian," Draco said, and there was an edge in it that was partly recitation and partly his own voice underneath, testing which one he was using. "Your father's definition of time well spent has led to some notable failures," Harry said, pleasantly. "I'll manage my own schedule." Draco looked at him for another moment. Then, slowly, as though he wasn't entirely sure this was a decision he'd made, he leaned back in his seat and said, "Fine. Tell me about this education of yours." They talked for 2 hours. Not performing, not maneuvering, just talking, Draco asking questions and Harry answering them directly and asking his own, Hermione eventually putting her book down entirely and joining in with the focused precision of someone who had decided that this conversation was more interesting than what she'd been reading, which was saying something. By the time the trolley came around with its sweets, Harry had established that Draco Malfoy was sharp, underserved by his education in anything that wasn't pureblood political theory, possessed of a dry humor he generally suppressed in favor of the performed variety, and genuinely, if cautiously, curious about a world larger than the one his family had described to him. He was worth knowing. Harry made this determination with the same straightforwardness he applied to everything, and having made it, proceeded accordingly. Draco bought a quantity of sweets that suggested he'd been told no frequently on this topic. Hermione bought nothing and then accepted a chocolate frog from Harry with the expression of someone doing him a favor, which he found amusing. The card inside was Dumbledore himself, which Harry looked at for a moment, the familiar face, the half-moon spectacles, the expression of benevolent wisdom that had been so thoroughly maneuvering for so long, and then placed carefully in the pocket of his robes. He'd keep it. It was good to have reminders. They changed into their robes as the train pulled toward Hogsmeade, and the castle appeared through the window in the early evening dark, first as an impression, lights against black, towers against a darker sky, and then as itself, immense and impossible and ancient in the way that very few things were ancient, a kind of age that was not just years but accumulated intention, the weight of every person who had ever lived and learned and changed inside its walls. Harry looked at it and felt something he didn't immediately have a name for. Not awe exactly, he had been prepared for the castle, had read about it, had heard Sirius and Regulus both describe it from memory with the particular quality of people who loved a place they left too young. But preparation was not the same as arrival, and arrival was its own thing. He filed the feeling away without naming it. He could name it later. The boats across the lake were traditional, first years only, and Harry sat in a boat with Hermione and a round-faced boy named Neville Longbottom who had lost his toad and then found it and was holding it with the careful tentativeness of someone slightly uncertain of their own competence. Harry had introduced himself and immediately noticed the look that passed across Neville's face, the recognition, the slight adjustment, and then something else beneath it, curiosity, and a careful kind of relief, as though the existence of Harry Black-Potter as actual person rather than the legend was somehow comforting. "Your family and mine have history," Harry said, as they crossed the black water. Neville looked at him carefully. "My parents," he said, and there was a weight in that Harry recognized. The war." "I know," Harry said. "I'm sorry about your parents, Neville." "Genuinely." Neville looked at him with the expression of someone who had been offered condolences many times, by many people, and could tell the difference between the real kind and the kind that was about the person offering them. "Thanks," he said, quietly. "I mean it." The castle grew above them as the boats crossed, and Harry looked up at it and thought about the shape of what was inside, the stone that Regulus had mentioned, secured somewhere on the third floor by what their intelligence suggested was a series of protections that were elaborate and well-meaning and almost certainly not sufficient. Dumbledore's design, probably. The old man had a fondness for tests with teeth. He thought about Quirinus Quirrell, the defense against the dark arts teacher whose appointment had been flagged in the research dossier as notable, a competent academic who had spent a year abroad and returned changed in ways that were consistent with a powerful external influence on his psychology. Regulus had circled this 3 times. He thought about the fact that Voldemort, whatever remained of him, had been trying to find ways back to a body for 10 years, and that the Philosopher's Stone, capable of producing the elixir of life, capable in theory of restoring a nearly dead thing to sustained existence, was sitting in a school full of children and one very specifically targeted 11-year-old. He was not concerned. He was paying attention. There was a difference, and it was a difference worth maintaining. The boats docked. They went inside. Professor McGonagall met them in the entrance hall with the manner of a woman who had done this 40 times and intended to do it properly regardless. She was exactly as Sirius had described her, Scottish severity, hawk-bright eyes, the posture of someone who had no patience for nonsense and considerable patience for excellence, and she looked at the assembled first years with the brisk assessment of someone sorting them into categories before the hat had the chance. Her eyes found Harry. Something moved across her face, not quite surprise, because she had presumably been informed, but the specific quality of confronting a thing you've been informed about versus the thing itself. Harry met her gaze with the respectful directness he'd learned from Arcturus, which was neither deference nor challenge but the straightforward acknowledgement of a person in front of you. McGonagall's expression adjusted fractionally. "This way," she said, and led them up the marble staircase. She left them in an antechamber and explained the sorting, and Harry listened to the other first year's whispered speculation about it with the relaxed attention of someone who knew the answer to the puzzle they were debating. He heard his name pass through the group twice in the way names did when they didn't know you were there, and he let it pass. A ghost walked through the wall. Ron Weasley, a red-haired boy Harry had noticed on the train and identified as one of the Weasley family by the coloring, whom he'd had no particular reason to speak to, made an impression of being startled that was slightly larger than his actual startlement. Several people laughed. The atmosphere loosened. McGonagall returned and led them into the great hall. The ceiling was the sky, or looked like it, charmed to reflect whatever was happening above, which tonight was cloud and star and the first cold dark of September. The hall itself was everything it was supposed to be, for long tables, hundreds of students, the faculty table at the far end where a row of faces turned to watch the first year's process in. Harry walked with the easy unhurried pace that was simply his normal pace, and he did not look for Dumbledore immediately, which was a choice he was aware of making. He took in the hall first, the whole geography of it, the students at the tables, the relationships between them visible in body language and proximity, the particular mood of a room that was simultaneously celebrating a tradition and watching something new. Then he looked at the faculty table. Dumbledore was in the center, as expected, tall even-seated, his silver beard catching the candlelight, his half-moon spectacles reflecting small flames. He was watching the first year's process in with the expression of settled benevolence that Harry had studied on the chocolate frog card, and when his gaze reached Harry, he stopped. Not visibly, not to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But Harry was paying close attention, and he saw the moment that Albus Dumbledore, for the first time in perhaps a very long time, encountered something he hadn't planned for. Harry held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he looked away, moving his attention forward to the stool and the sorting hat as though the headmaster were simply another face in a room of faces, which was precisely what Harry intended him to feel. The hat was old and patched and it sang its song, a longer song than usual, Harry noted, with an additional verse about unity that felt like it was about something specific, and then the sorting began. He listened as names were called and students sat and the hat deliberated. Lavender Brown, Gryffindor, to her evident delight. Millicent Bulstrode, Slytherin, without drama. Justin Finch-Fletchley, Hufflepuff. Hermione, her name called with her full name, Hermione Jean Granger, walked to the stool with her chin up and the hat on her head for barely 20 seconds before it called Gryffindor, and she went to the Gryffindor table with the expression of someone whose prediction has been confirmed and who feels thoroughly vindicated about it. Neville Longbottom sat under the hat for nearly 4 minutes. Harry, watching from the line, thought about what Arcturus had said, the hat is legilimentary, it reads the broad shape of a person. He wondered what Neville's broad shape looked like. Brave, he thought. Afraid of being brave, which was different from not being brave. The hat would see both. Gryffindor, the hat said, and Neville walked to the table with the expression of someone who has been told something they're not sure they believe yet but intend to consider seriously. Draco Malfoy went after him, sat down, hat barely touched his head, Slytherin, announced before most people had finished blinking. He went to the Slytherin table with the composure of a completed mission, but he met Harry's eye as he went, and what was in that glance was more complicated than satisfaction. Then, Black-Potter, Hadrian. The hall went quiet. Not the polite quiet of routine sorting. The complete, sudden, held-breath quiet of a room that has been waiting for something and has just heard the signal. Harry walked to the stool through a silence so complete he could hear the candles. He sat. The hat came down over his eyes and ears and the world went away, replaced by the dim warm dark and the particular sensation of something old and aware settling its attention on him. "Well," said the hat, and its voice was dry and interested and unlike any voice he'd heard, carrying the quality of something that had been having conversations for 1,000 years. "I have been waiting for you. I've been preparing for you," Harry thought back. Quite a preparation it is. The hat was moving through him, not intrusively, more like the feeling of someone walking through a well-lit house, noting what was in each room. Power, yes. Considerable power, well managed, which is rarer than the power alone. Ambition, not the shallow kind, the deep structural kind that makes plans rather than wishes. Loyalty, though you'd argue the word. Intelligence, absolutely. Bravery, certainly, though you'd argue that word too. I'd say I'm thorough, Harry thought. The categories feel reductive. They are reductive. That is their function. A pause. The hat was looking at something specific now, something deeper. You know what the hat does, don't you? You know the houses aren't about what you are but about what you're given to become. I know that Gryffindor gives recklessness the name of courage, Slytherin gives self-interest the name of ambition, Ravenclaw gives accumulation the name of wisdom, and Hufflepuff gives decency the name of loyalty, Harry thought. And I know that the actual qualities and their institutional versions aren't the same thing. And knowing all that, the hat said, you still have a preference. Harry was quiet for a moment in the dark under the hat. The hall was very still around him. I want, he thought carefully, to be where the challenge is. I want to be where the assumptions are the hardest to shift, where the preconceptions are the most entrenched, where what I am will do the most work simply by being present. I want the place where Voldemort was sorted, because I intend to be everything he failed to be, and I want that contrast to be visible. That, the hat said, with something in its voice that might have been satisfaction, is the most Slytherin reasoning I have heard in 30 years. Then you know where to put me, Harry thought. The hat raised its brim, opened its wide rip of a mouth, and shouted into the silent hall, Slytherin. The noise that followed was extraordinary. Not the usual cheer of a house claiming its new member, the Slytherin table was applauding, yes, and with genuine enthusiasm, some of them on their feet, but the entire hall doing something that was not quite silence and not quite sound, the noise of 400 people recalibrating simultaneously. A collective sharp intake of breath that was the wizarding world's institutional memory getting something it had not expected and did not know how to process. Harry took the hat off and set it on the stool and walked to the Slytherin table with the even unhurried stride that was simply how he walked, and he could feel the hall watching him go and he let them watch because there was nothing here to hide and he wasn't interested in hiding it. He sat down. Draco, 3 seats away, caught his eye, and on Draco's face was an expression that was doing something unprecedented, something warm, genuine, with the particular quality of a person who has just had a bet confirmed that they didn't know they'd made. Harry sat, and at the faculty table, he knew without looking, because he had Arcturus's voice in his head saying you will not need to look, you will feel it, that Albus Dumbledore was sitting very still and thinking very hard and revising, for the first time in 10 years, the shape of his plan. Dumbledore's speech at the feast was warm and measured and contained, Harry noted, a specific emphasis on the importance of interhouse unity, on the value of trusting one's teachers, on the third-floor corridor that was forbidden to all students and which Dumbledore described with the tone of someone who knew quite well that describing a thing as forbidden was one of the more reliable methods of directing attention toward it. He filed that away too. The feast itself was extraordinary in the simple sense of being excellent food in generous quantity. Harry ate with the focused appreciation of someone who took good food seriously, which was a perspective he had arrived at for reasons that were no longer painful but were not forgotten. The Slytherin table received him with the particular mixture of curiosity and politics that he had expected, students who had heard his name all their lives and were now reassessing the gap between reputation and person, students who saw the House of Black connection and were calculating its implications, 1 or 2 who were simply interested because he was interesting. A 5th year named Marcus Flint asked, with the bluntness of someone who had decided that directness was more useful than subtlety, why Slytherin? Everyone said you'd be Gryffindor. Everyone said a lot of things about me that turned out to be wrong, Harry said. I'm here because it's where I belong. Your grandfather's a Black, Flint said. And Slytherin. So. Among other reasons, Harry said. A prefect named Gemma Farley, who had the focused intelligence of someone who was taking mental notes professionally, asked about his wand. Black walnut, Harry said. Phoenix feather. 11 inches. She went still. That's, who told you, Ollivander, Harry said. He seemed to think it was notable. The information moved down the Slytherin table like the ripple in the leaky cauldron. Harry let it move. There was no advantage in concealing the wand, it would be known by morning in any case, and a piece of information you shared yourself was always less useful as a weapon to someone else than a piece of information they discovered. After the feast, Professor Snape arrived. He had been at the faculty table during dinner. Harry had placed him precisely, had noted the black robes and the controlled stillness and the general impression of a man who was perpetually disappointed in the world and had organized his entire presentation around this disappointment. He had also, because Regulus had known Severus Snape personally and had described him with the bleak accuracy of a former colleague, understood that the disappointment was not the whole story and probably not even the most interesting part of it. Snape led the Slytherin first years to the dungeons with the manner of someone conducting a military inspection rather than a welcoming tour. He stopped them in the common room, green-lit from the lake, dark wood and silver fixtures, comfortable in a subterranean way that Harry found he didn't mind at all, and regarded the assembled students with the expression of a man about to make something clear. His gaze reached Harry and paused. Harry held it the way he held everyone's gaze, steady, neither challenging nor deferential, simply present. Black-Potter, Snape said. His voice was exactly as Regulus had described it, quiet and precise with an edge like a clean blade. I knew your father. I'm aware, Harry said. A pause. Something moved in Snape's dark eyes, not quite surprise, but its close relative. You are aware. My family is thorough, Harry said. Regulus Black spoke of you. The calculation that moved across Snape's face was, for a man of his practiced composure, remarkably visible. He recovered it quickly. Regulus Black is dead. Is he? Harry said. The Slytherin common room was very quiet. Snape held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he said, I will be your head of house this year, and I suggest you spend the first week establishing what Hogwarts requires of you before you begin establishing what you require of Hogwarts. Good night. He turned. Prefects will show you to your dormitories. He left. Draco appeared at Harry's shoulder. What was that? He said, quietly. A conversation, Harry said. We'll have more of them. He knows something, Draco said. He knows several things, Harry said. Most of which I know too. The question is what we each decide to do about it. Draco looked at him with those grey eyes that were, Harry had decided, more interesting than they were supposed to be. You've been here 4 hours. I've been preparing for this for 7 years, Harry said. The 4 hours are just when the preparation became useful. He went to bed in the Slytherin dormitory, which was cool and quiet and very far below the surface of the lake, greenish light shifting on the ceiling, and lay in the dark thinking about the day. Dumbledore's face when the hat called Slytherin. Snape's face when he mentioned Regulus. McGonagall's face in the entrance hall. Hermione, sorted into Gryffindor but already established as someone he would find a way to work with regardless of the colors on her robes. Neville Longbottom, who didn't believe yet in his own courage. He thought about the 3rd-floor corridor. He thought about Quirrell. He thought about how Voldemort, wherever he was and in whatever form, had been waiting 10 years for this moment, for Harry Potter to come to Hogwarts, to be in the same building as the Philosopher's Stone, to make himself findable. He was not afraid. He was not worried. He was, as he had been for the past 2 years since Arcturus had put the dossier in front of him, simply preparing the next move. He went to sleep. The first week of classes established several things with the efficiency of structured information. Charms, Professor Flitwick, who met Harry with the barely controlled delight of a man greeting something he had theorized about for years and was thrilled to confirm. He had heard about the wandless work. Ollivander talked, it turned out, in the specific way that people who were passionate about their field talked, to other people who were passionate, and he set Harry a standard first-year exercise with the visible intention of seeing what happened and then spent the next 20 minutes of the lesson clearly recalibrating his curriculum. Transfiguration, Professor McGonagall, who set them to turning matches into needles and watched Harry produce a silver needle from a match in approximately 12 seconds on his first attempt and then, without being asked, do it backwards, and whose expression moved through several stages before arriving at the one she used for things she found genuinely impressive and refused to show. Astronomy, fine. The sky was the sky. Harry had been studying star charts for 3 years because Arcturus believed in knowing the fundamentals and because the magical applications of celestial positioning were more interesting than the Muggle version. He was not particularly challenged. Herbology, also fine, though Harry found himself genuinely interested in a way he hadn't anticipated. The relationship between plant magic and intent was less mechanical than the book suggested, and Professor Sprout's approach to it was practical and grounded and free of the performance that some of the other professors seemed unable to avoid. Defense against the dark arts, Quirrell. Harry sat in Quirrell's first class and paid the kind of attention he paid to things that required it, which was a different quality from his attention in charms or transfiguration, focused, multi-layered, the surface of it on the lesson and the deeper part on the man delivering it. Quirrell wore a purple turban and his hands shook with the fine tremor of someone who was managing something effortful at all times, and when he moved through the classroom there was a quality to the air around him that was not quite right, not the absence of rightness but the presence of something else, something that had the specific signature that Regulus had described in his notes on Voldemort's soul magic. The room smelled faintly of something Harry associated with the darkest section of Regulus's library. Not strongly. Not obviously. Probably imperceptible to students who hadn't spent years with a man who had memorized the olfactory signature of every dark artifact he'd encountered. Harry wrote 3 sentences in the margin of his notes during the lesson that were not about Quirrell's lecture on vampires. He would send them to Regulus with his first weekly letter to Arcturus. After class, he fell into step with Hermione in the corridor. She was in the opposite house but their lesson schedules overlapped more than not, which was presumably Dumbledore's doing or simply scheduling coincidence, and he had decided not to assign agency to things that might be arithmetic, and she said, without preamble, something's wrong with Quirrell. He looked at her. What makes you say that? He's afraid of something, she said. Professors aren't usually afraid. And the turban is inconsistent with everything else about his presentation. And I looked up his academic record. He had a perfectly normal career until a year abroad, and then, he came back different, Harry said. Yes. She looked at him. You noticed too. I noticed, Harry said. I have context you probably don't. She gave him the evaluating look. Are you going to tell me the context? Some of it, Harry said. Later. When I've confirmed a few things. She was quiet for a moment, not frustrated. He appreciated this, just processing. Is it dangerous? Potentially, Harry said. Not immediately. I'm working on a timeline. Are you going to tell a professor? I'm going to gather more information first, Harry said. And then I'm going to decide who tells what to whom and in what order. She stopped walking. He stopped too. You know what it is, she said. You knew before you came here. He held her gaze. I came to Hogwarts knowing a number of things, he said carefully. Some of which I'm going to need help with, and some of which I'm going to handle differently than people expect. I'm telling you this because you're the most honest person I've met here and because when the time comes I'd rather you were informed than not. Hermione looked at him for a long time. The corridor was busy around them, other students, class changes, the general Hogwarts mid-morning bustle, but she was very still in the middle of it. All right, she said. I trust you. I know, Harry said. Thank you. They walked on. Snape's first potions lesson was a different kind of experience from most things that week. He entered the dungeon classroom with the manner of a professor who considered the classroom entirely his domain and made this clear through a kind of practiced atmospheric control. The quality of the room changed when he entered it, the air got slightly more deliberate, the way a room changes when someone with very strong presence walks into it. He called roll in the manner of a man reading a legal document, and when he reached Harry's name he paused in the specific way he'd paused in the common room, the calculation visible briefly before the composure covered it. Ah, yes, Snape said, in the quiet precise voice. Harry Black-Potter. Our new celebrity. The word was deployed like a scalpel, designed to produce a specific reaction in someone who cared about it. Harry received it without reaction, which was its own kind of response. Can you tell me, Snape said, moving through the rows, the difference between a bezoar and a flobberworm mucus, Mr. Black-Potter? The correct uses of hellebore. The properties of wolfsbane. He stopped at Harry's desk and looked down with the expectation of a man who had done this with Potter père and knew exactly what to expect. A bezoar is a calcified concretion from a goat's stomach, used as an antidote to most poisons, Harry said, in the same conversational tone he used for everything. Flobberworm mucus is a base potion thickener with no independent antidotal properties, primarily used in elementary healing potions for consistency. Hellebore has nervous system applications primarily and is used in the draught of peace and the strengthening solution, though it requires careful preparation because the active alkaloids are toxic in concentration. And wolfsbane is the common name for aconitum, which in potion form suppresses lycanthropic transformation. The correct name for the prepared potion is the wolfsbane potion, which is extraordinarily difficult to brew because the preparation window is narrow and a single contamination destroys the batch. He met Snape's eyes. My grandfather maintains a private library of 700 potions texts, Harry said. And my uncle Regulus has a specific interest in advanced restorative potions. I've been educated thoroughly. The classroom was completely silent. Every student was looking at Snape, waiting. Snape held his gaze for a long moment. There was something happening behind his eyes, something more complicated than the standard reaction to an unexpected student answer. Harry thought about what Snape knew, what he must know, if he'd known Regulus, if he'd known the network of people he'd known, and watched him decide what to do with it. 5 points to Slytherin, Snape said, finally, with the air of a man making a tactical decision. And 4 inches of parchment on the independent properties of bezoars, to be submitted by Thursday. In case there are gaps in your library. Of course, Professor, Harry said. Snape moved on. Harry opened his potions kit and set up his workspace with the same precision he brought to everything. Across the aisle, Draco caught his eye with a look that managed, without any visible facial movement, to communicate something on the order of "I can't believe that just happened." Harry set out his pewter cauldron and his knife and his scale, and he thought about Snape, who was a complicated person in a complicated position, who had loved someone Harry's mother had once been and had never quite found a way out of that grief, who was a spy or had been a spy or was still a spy, the answer to which question mattered considerably, and he thought, there is a version of this where Snape is useful, and a version where he is an obstacle, and which version obtains will depend on what he decides to do with what he knows. The first practical session was a simple potion, Boil Cure for Boils, elementary, designed to assess basic technique rather than knowledge. Harry brewed it correctly on the first attempt and spent the remaining time reading ahead in the textbook while Draco's cauldron produced something slightly too thick and Neville Longbottom, from across the room, managed to melt his cauldron at the 30-minute mark, producing a small flood that required Snape's intervention and a severe look. Harry caught Neville's eye across the room. The boy was red-faced and miserable with the expression of someone confirming their worst opinion of themselves. Harry gave him a small, deliberate nod. Not pity, acknowledgement. The kind that said this class is his, not this subject, and there's a difference. Neville looked at him for a moment and then, slowly, some of the misery reorganized itself into something more like determination. It was a small thing. Harry filed it with the other small things, which were the ones that mattered. By the end of the first week, 3 things had been established beyond reasonable doubt. The first was that Quirrell was a problem that needed addressing on a timeline that was measured in months rather than years, and that the thing beneath his turban was exactly what the dossier had suggested it might be. The second was that Dumbledore was watching Harry with the careful attention of a chess player who has found an unexpected piece on the board, not hostile, not yet, not openly, but with the particular quality of someone recalibrating a very long-term plan and uncertain of where the new variable fit. The third was that Harry had been at Hogwarts for 5 days and had already acquired, without particularly trying, a set of relationships that were more interesting than anything a plan could have produced. Hermione, who could keep pace with him academically and challenged him on everything else. Draco, who was unlearning things more quickly than Harry had expected and who came to his dormitory on Thursday evening with a look that meant he had a question he wasn't sure was appropriate. Neville, who was paying attention to Harry in the specific way of someone who has been told their whole life that they're not enough and is beginning to wonder if the source of that information was reliable. Even Snape, who was a problem and an asset in proportions that would take time to determine. On Saturday morning he went to the library and wrote his first weekly letter to Arcturus, which covered the sorting, the week's observations, his assessment of Quirrell, 3 questions about soul magic theory, and a note about Snape that he phrased carefully because he wasn't entirely sure yet what Snape was. He wrote a shorter letter to Regulus separately, with the 3 margin notes from Quirrell's class and a request for the specific detection method Regulus had described in his notes on Voldemort's soul fragments. He addressed it to Regulus's alias. He was sealing the second letter when he heard footsteps and looked up to find Dumbledore himself standing between 2 bookshelves, dressed in robes of deep blue with silver stars, looking at Harry with the expression of a man who has decided that a direct approach is preferable to waiting. "Harry," Dumbledore said, and his voice was exactly as warm as it appeared in every account Harry had ever read of it. "May I sit?" Harry gestured at the opposite chair. Dumbledore sat with the ease of a man entirely comfortable with himself and his surroundings, and he looked at Harry with those blue eyes that were simultaneously genuine and calculating, which was the most honest description of Albus Dumbledore that Harry had ever come across, a man whose warmth was real and whose maneuvering was also real, and who had never fully resolved the tension between the two. "I had hoped to speak with you before the term began," Dumbledore said. "Your grandfather's schedule was understandably full." "He keeps a busy calendar," Harry said. "I imagine he does." A pause. "I want you to know, Harry, that I am glad you are here. Whatever the particular path that brought you to Hogwarts, I am glad it ends here." "It doesn't end here," Harry said. "It continues here. There's a difference." Something moved in Dumbledore's eyes, amusement, and underneath it, assessment. "A fair distinction." He paused. "How are you finding Slytherin?" "Interesting," Harry said. "Appropriate." "Your grandfather's house," Dumbledore observed. "Among other things," Harry said. He kept his tone conversational, his shields in their structural configuration, not the obvious variety that announced themselves, but the deep-layered kind Regulus had built into him, the kind that gave a surface that felt entirely open. "Headmaster, I appreciate you coming to speak with me, and I'd like to be straightforward with you." Dumbledore's expression shifted very slightly. "Please do." "I know about the stone," Harry said. "I know about the protections on the 3rd floor. I know about the broader reason it's there, and I have some specific concerns about the particular threat it faces that I believe you should be aware of." The library was very quiet. Dumbledore was looking at him with an expression that was, for the first time in the conversation, entirely unguarded, not performing warmth or performing wisdom, simply looking at this 11-year-old boy who had just demonstrated that he had been paying a very different kind of attention than expected. "I see," Dumbledore said, after a moment. "I'm not going to do anything reckless," Harry said. "I'm going to gather information, assess the threat accurately, and then we're going to have another conversation, a more specific one, about what I think should be done about it. At that point I'll share what I know and we can discuss how to proceed together." "Together," Dumbledore repeated, as though the word were interesting. "I am not operating against you," Harry said. "I am operating with my own judgment, which is a different thing. And I'd like, if possible, for us to be in the same direction most of the time, because I think we want the same outcome, broadly." "Only broadly?" Dumbledore asked. "The specific path to that outcome is where we'll disagree," Harry said. "And I expect that honestly, and so should you." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite what Harry had expected, something that was less manipulation and more genuine, the sound of a very old and very tired man encountering something that genuinely surprised him. "Your grandfather prepared you very well, Harry." He did, Harry said. But I'm not my grandfather. I'm also not the person you planned for. He held Dumbledore's gaze. I'm better prepared and less controllable, which I expect is simultaneously reassuring and inconvenient. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, he smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reached those blue eyes, the kind that didn't perform anything, and it was the first entirely genuine thing Harry had seen from him. Yes, Dumbledore said. That is exactly what you are. He stood, straightening his robes. I look forward to our more specific conversation, Harry. I suspect it will be among the more interesting I have had in a long time. I expect the same, Harry said. Dumbledore walked between the bookshelves and was gone. Harry looked at the sealed letters in front of him. He added a postscript to Arcturus's. Dumbledore came to me. He's adjusting. I'll keep you informed. Then he picked up both letters and went to find the Owlery, walking through the Saturday morning Hogwarts with his hands in his pockets and Hedwig flying to meet him from the tower before he'd quite reached it, which was a trick she'd been doing since August and which suggested she was possibly smarter than owls were supposed to be, or possibly that she'd simply decided that meeting him halfway was more efficient than waiting. He held out his arm and she landed on it with the dignity of an owl who found punctuality admirable. 2 letters, he told her. Different addresses. She looked at him with amber eyes that conveyed, with the eloquence available to owls, that she was aware. He stepped out onto the Owlery's open gallery into the sharp September morning, the castle below him and the ground spreading out in every direction and the lake flat and grey in the distance, and he looked at Hogwarts, his castle now, in the specific sense that all new students claimed it without realizing they were doing so, and thought about what came next. It was going to be a very interesting year.